Chapter 281, Doberman. The moment the colonel's orders rang out, the crew of the Poseidon snapped into action with unflinching resolve. Under the stern command, they'd already begun to develop that famed iron-blooded discipline. Deep in the bowels of the ship, the engines rumbled, boom, 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 sending vibrations through the decks. Then a sharp knock echoed at the captain's cabin door. A young sailor burst in, breathless. "Sir, a naval warship off the starboard bow." Charles was halfway through his meal. With perfect calm, he lifted a handkerchief and wiped a smear of grease from his lip. He let out a low chuckle. "Excellent," he said. "Scramble a boarding party, get eyes on them, and make sure our Rockefeller pirates leave an impression they'll never forget." He set down his knife and fork, rose to his full height, and stepped from the cabin. Behind him, the couples who'd been dining scattered up the corridor, excitement written on their faces. Their children raced ahead, and the mothers, not wanting to be left behind, gently laid down their plates and hurried after. Charles paused in the doorway, a smile tugging at his mouth. He'd been wondering how to forge his crew's reputation, and here, the Navy had practically delivered him a stage. He called out over the clamor, "North Sea Fleet, prepare yourselves. The Rockefeller pirates have arrived." As he stepped out onto the deck, a crowd of sailors was already gathered, all eyes fixed on the horizon. Charles surveyed them with satisfaction. Everything was falling into place. Charles gave Barrett a grateful nod. None of this would have been possible without his remarkable first mate. Not only did Barrett possess extraordinary strength, but his leadership and organizational skills were equally impressive. Charles eagerly accepted the binoculars Barrett passed him and trained them on the approaching figure. A young naval officer stood out against the horizon, clad in a crisp captain's uniform. A long cutlass hung at his side, hand resting on the hilt as he advanced. The officer's dark-skinned face was etched with a lattice of scars that instantly reminded Charles of Lieutenant General Doberman, the only man bold enough to challenge red-haired shanks of the four emperors in their famous clash. Charles remembered how impressed he'd been with Doberman's audacity and skill. Yet this newcomer was merely a colonel, and still he dared to close in on their ship? Audacious or simply reckless? Charles rubbed his chin, a spark of interest lighting his eyes. After more than a month at sea battling nothing but sea kings, a face-off with the Navy sounded like just the diversion he needed. "Looks like we have a guest," Charles said, a sly smile curling his lips. "Let's go meet our young colonel." His crew, catching the gleam in their captain's eye, broke into broad grins of their own. Charles's lips curled into a mocking grin. For years now, no Navy dared to cross him in the New World. Every fleet we'd encountered steered clear, terrified of accidentally drawing our ire. Yet here we were, in the North Sea, watching a naval warship brazenly close the distance, apparently ignorant of who we were. A low, hungry murmur rippled through my crew. Several men sketched their long knives from their belts, running blades across their tongues in anticipation. Their eyes glittered red with bloodlust. But as the enemy vessel drew nearer, First Mate Doberman's smile faded. He straightened and gripped the hilt of his own blade, sensing that something was terribly wrong. In every past encounter, the moment a pirate ship appeared on the horizon, navies had turned tail. But this ship held its course. It surged forward, unflinching. Doberman's jaw clenched. He recognized the black swallowtail pennant fluttering above the stern, a Jolly Roger we knew all too well. Killing intent sparked in Doberman's dark eyes as the stranger's hull loomed closer. On the deck of the warship Sea God Poseidon, every sailor froze, bracing for the inevitable clash. The tension crackled in the salt-heavy air. Neither our side would yield, and neither would run. "That ship is enormous." The sailors couldn't hide their astonishment as the colossal vessel loomed ahead. Beside it, their three warships looked like mere toys. "Silence!" Admiral Doberman roared. "Open fire!" In an instant, cannon muzzles flared aboard all three ships, spewing iron shot toward the giant hull. Charles stood perfectly still, watching without a word. At his side, Elena rose calmly to her feet. Everyone's attention snapped to her as she lifted her jade-pale hands. From her fingertips flowed a surge of iridescent bubbles that raced toward the oncoming cannonballs. One by one, the shells struck the floating spheres and harmlessly fizzled out. Doberman's stern expression flickered with irritation. A devil fruit user, he growled under his breath. He hated facing devil fruit abilities. Their unpredictable powers could turn the tide in an instant, and if you weren't cautious, you could find yourself on the losing end of some cruel trick. In the months since his promotion, he'd tangled with a handful of devil fruit-wielding pirates, mostly the animal types, but this bubble technique was unlike anything he'd seen, and it made the looming challenge even more dangerous. Because the ship was so tall, Doberman couldn't see who or what awaited him on the opposing deck. Elena let out a shimmering cascade of bubbles, then glanced at Charles with a faint, confident smile. Charles returned the grin. This bubble barrier was Elena's latest innovation. As Charles ventured farther into dangerous seas, she'd felt an ever-growing urgency to protect him. Ever since Klein was born, she'd trained relentlessly to deepen her mastery of the bubble fruit. 5 years of practice had made bubble armor and defense techniques second nature. Creating a cushion of bubbles to blunt cannon fire was child's play to her. Damn it, all that, and still no effect, Elena muttered under her breath. On the other side, Doberman's face twisted with frustration when his cannonballs splattered harmlessly against the bubble wall. He barked an order to his crew. Charge! Overwhelm those pirates, no mercy! Drawing his long knife, he sprang forward. Moonstep. In an instant, he activated the Navy's sixth style and vaulted onto the deck below in one fluid motion. As he landed, he froze. Hundreds of ruthless eyes turned to stare at him from every shadowed corner. A tense silence fell, broken only by the soft pop of drifting bubbles. Doberman tightened his grip on his blade and prepared to strike. Doberman's heart pounded as he met their stares. Playful disdain, thinly veiled sarcasm, but not a flicker of fear. Instinctively, he tightened his grip on the long knife at his side, ready to spring. At the center of the group stood a man who seemed to radiate effortless confidence. Golden hair tumbled over his shoulders, and his crimson and gold coat gleamed with opulent embroidery. A faint, knowing smile curved his lips as he regarded Doberman. Recognition jolted through Doberman's veins. "Rockefeller Charles," he blurted, disbelief and shock cracking his voice. Could the infamous pirate of the New World really have sailed into the North Sea? It was unthinkable. Yet here he was. Charles's lips curved higher into that cool, amused smile. "It seems you know me. Your teacher Zephyr has apparently told you about me." He tossed his head, sweeping a glance over Doberman's uneasy companions before locking eyes with Doberman again. "Teacher?" At the mention of Zephyr, Doberman felt his chest tighten. He forced himself to take in the rest of Charles's entourage, soldiers in sleek black uniforms, their hands hovering near weapons, and looming at the back, a 5-meter giant whose straw-blonde hair and stern countenance gave him the air of an immovable sentinel. For a long moment, the two sides simply stared at each other across the deck's icy planks, the tension crackling like distant thunder. Then Charles's smile deepened, and the legend of the New World, here on the North Sea, became all too real. Charles glanced to his side and spotted a girl who couldn't have been more than 12, her round, innocent features belying any notion of danger. She rested both small hands on the hilt of a gleaming Western-style sword at her waist. Beside her stood a lanky youth with an almost languid expression. His lazy eyes roved over the surroundings, immediately reminding Charles of the so-called natural monster from the training camp. Behind them, a half-dozen pirates closed in, blades, knives, and short swords clutched tightly in their hands, their gazes fixed on Charles with unmistakable menace. Chapter 282, Governor of Bahai Doberman's thoughts spun wildly as he stood on the deck, hemmed in by dozens of pirates. His heart pounded. No matter how fast he ran, he had nowhere to go. Before him stood Charles, the world's greatest swordsman and the most feared pirate of the New World. Would he really let a lowly naval officer escape? Behind Charles, the pirate crew erupted in mocking laughter. "Captain, look at him," one of them jeered. "Our little bluecoat is shaking in his boots." Charles offered a faint, dismissive smile, but said nothing. He turned his dark eyes on Doberman and nodded slowly. "Impressive courage, Navy officer," he drawled. "You're the first from your fleet to dare board my ship. That takes nerve." Shields of rage flashed across Doberman's face. "Pirate scum," he spat. "How dare you insult the Royal Navy? Give the order. Tear him into pieces." As more Marines clambered up the boarding ladders behind him, Doberman's composure finally snapped. He barked frantic commands. "Fall back! This isn't where you're supposed to be!" But it was too late. Charles's crew pressed forward, swords drawn, and the deck rang with the glint of steel. The showdown had begun. "That ship's crew calls themselves the Rockefeller Pirates. Send word to Navy headquarters at once," Colonel Doberman ordered. His Marines exchanged uneasy glances as they swept the deck, beholding the bloodthirsty horde arrayed before them. A few men wavered, but most stood their ground, muskets leveled and hearts pounding. One lieutenant leaned in, voice tight. "Sir, I don't think they're taking us seriously." Across the deck, Charles surveyed his crew with a satisfied grin. Over 100 disciplined Marines meant little to his buccaneers, men who'd seen nothing but battle since they'd set sail under his black flag. They'd weathered skirmishes with the beast pirates and trailed Wano samurai through the windless zone, their nerves stretched thin. They'd enjoyed watching rival crews clash, but now they hungered for their own victory. Charles dropped his hand to the hilt of his cutlass. "All right then. Attack!" At his command, more than 300 pirates surged forward, voices raised in triumphant shouts. Blades glittered and pistols cracked as they smashed into Doberman's line, igniting a ferocious melee on the sun-scorched deck. "Sword hero?" Doberman's eyes went wide as he witnessed the sudden flying slash. His men had just been cut down by a single stroke of that blade. Enraged, he launched himself at the swordsman, but it was a hopeless charge. With a single, sweeping arc of his greatsword, Lowell sent Doberman sprawling. The lieutenant crashed onto the hard deck, coughing up blood in a crimson spray. "What? How can he be this strong?" Doberman wheezed. Doberman was no seasoned general, just a fresh boot camp graduate, a raw recruit with barely any field experience. Lowell, on the other hand, was a master swordsman, fearsome in technique and aura, one of the Rockefeller pirates' very strongest. No greenhorn could withstand even one of his blows. "Colonel," the Marines cried out in horror. "Don't worry, our turn is coming," another shouted. Emboldened by their captain's display of power, over 100 Marines surged forward, only to be cut down in an instant, their bodies collapsing across the deck. Only Doberman remained, pinned chest down to the blood-slicked deck by Lauer's blade. Lauer stepped back, gesturing for Charles to finish the job himself. Charles strode forward, his boots splashing in the crimson puddles. Doberman lifted his head, blood bubbling at his lips. In a ragged gasp, he spat onto the deck and snarled, "You bastard! The Marshal will avenge us!" Charles paused a few feet away, eyes cold. "Is that a promise?" he asked softly. "Let him come." Fury flared in Doberman's eyes. He coughed, the taste of iron thick on his tongue. "You pirate scum! You'll die for this!" "Tsk, tsk," Charles said, shaking his head. He waved one hand as though dismissing a child. "All your Navy ships combined won't save you now. None of you will escape." Then, turning his back, he spoke without looking over his shoulder. "Men, finish him." Two of Charles's crew moved in to secure Doberman's arms, but the wounded commander kept up a steady stream of curses, hurling threats as coarse as the sea. The tirade grated on Charles's nerves. With a sudden pivot, Charles drew the 7-star sword. In a single fluid motion, he swung, steel flashing in the lantern light, and the blade struck true. Doberman's head fell to the deck with a dull thud, and his body slumped into silence. Charles sheathed his sword and surveyed the scene. The deck lay quiet now, the battle won, and the last of his enemies cut down at his feet. Charles tightened his jaw as Lowell, poised to strike, froze mid-swing. The acrid scent of blood filled the air. With a curt nod, Lowell slowly withdrew his blade. "Clear it up," Charles commanded, his voice cool and steady. "That stench of death must be erased." He raised a hand to silence the handful of groaning survivors they'd spared. "Good. Only a few of you will live to tell the tale. Go, spread the word across the North Sea. The Rockefeller name sails these waters again, proclaiming me, Charles Rockefeller, its master." Satisfied, Charles turned on his heel, hands clasped behind his back as he strode toward the quarterdeck. He knew exactly what he was doing. By letting these men escape, he'd ignite fear in every Navy sailor's heart, building his legend ahead of the next raid. After all, few pirates could boast a bounty as staggering as his. 30 billion Baileys. Charles had learned of that price tag only a month ago, when he and his crew slipped out of the windless belt and into the open ocean. A battered newspaper, rescued from the wreckage of a drifting galleon, had shouted his name in bold letters, 30 billion Baileys for the head of Charles Rockefeller, a figure that, until then, he'd scarcely dared to imagine. Now, as the Rockefeller flagship cut through the North Sea's rolling waves, word of their latest slaughter raced ahead of them on terrified tongues. In the grand halls of the North Sea governor's mansion, a flurry of alarm bells rang out. "What did you say?" the governor's aide gasped, clutching the dispatch in trembling hands. Within moments, chaos would erupt, and Charles Rockefeller would be at the center of it all. Governor Darren of the North Sea sat behind his oaken desk, his dark eyes narrowing as 4 bedraggled sailors were herded before him. Their uniforms were ripped, their faces smeared with salt and blood. The governor's gauntleted finger tapped the desktop with growing impatience. "You face the Rockefeller pirates?" Darren's voice was cold steel. The closest sailor swallowed hard. "Yes, Lord Governor, yes! They spared our lives only to send a warning." His lip trembled as he spoke, eyes darting around the chamber. "They said to bring word back here." Darren held up the Navy's wanted poster, issued only weeks ago, and pointed at the portrait. It showed a young man in a battered tricorn, sword strapped to his side, Rockefeller Charles. "Are you certain this is who you saw?" The sailors exchanged frantic glances, then one swallowed, rigid with fear. It was him, sir. Charles himself. He cut down Colonel Doberman with one stroke, then tossed the body's head into the sea. They all nodded, faces pale as chalk. Darren exhaled so sharply the candles flickered. He rose from his chair, lifting the document as if it burned his fingers. How is this possible?" He paced the length of the room, boots echoing against the stone floor. No dispatch had come from Navy headquarters. No squadron had reported Charles in these waters. Yet the testimony was unanimous and horrifying. Governor Darren pressed a hand to his forehead, staring out at the storm-lashed windows. "If Rockefeller Charles has slipped into the North Sea, we are blind," he muttered. "Summon the admirals, double our patrols, and alert every port. There will be no mercy for pirates who dare challenge the crown here." He returned to his desk, determination hardening his features. The North Sea would not fall to one man, even one as deadly as Rockefeller Charles. But first, he had to find him. "Lieutenant Admiral Darren," Major General Sikorsky snapped, rising from his seat and pounding the table. "Stop wasting time debating how Charles Rockefeller slipped into the North Sea. Order Navy headquarters to dispatch an admiral immediately and bring those Rockefeller pirates to justice." Sikorsky's sudden outburst carried a fierce disappointment. He'd been observing the governor for over a month, and what he'd seen amounted to little more than a wealthy nobleman leaning on his world government connections to lord over Beihai. Now, Sikorsky refused to stand by, while that same privilege undermined the Navy's authority, especially with the notorious Rockefeller crew on the loose. Chapter 283, Lieutenant General Darren. For a month, Charles had worked in silence, gathering proof of Governor Darren's betrayal. Piece by piece, he uncovered a web of corruption. The governor was embezzling naval funds, secretly docking sailors' pay, and forging back-channel alliances with the kingdom's army. Under Darren's watch, pirate attacks in the North Sea had skyrocketed. No accident, but part of his scheme to enrich himself. Every echelon of the fleet had been compromised by his influence. Charles planned to deliver the evidence to Admiral Moses via his contact, Mr. Zifa. Before he could act, however, a new crisis erupted. The Rockefeller pirates had suddenly surfaced, and their arrival threatened to spiral out of control. Alerting Naval Command became the immediate priority. Back at the governor's headquarters, Lieutenant General Darren stiffened when the report reached him. "Understood. Reach out to Naval Headquarters at once," he barked. Producing a concealed uplink device, he keyed in the secure frequency and dialed. "Admiral Moses? This is Governor Darren in the North Sea. Urgent intelligence incoming." At Naval Headquarters, Sora, tasked with monitoring all incoming transmissions, heard Darren's voice crackle over the speaker. She immediately frowned, bracing herself for the fallout. Charles had known, ever since he'd been parachuted in as governor of Beihai 5 years ago, that the Navy headquarters held him in low regard. So when his phone buzzed with an urgent summons, his stomach knotted. "This is Admiral Sora," he answered briskly. "Admiral, it's Darren," came the frantic reply. "We've got a major incident. The Rockefeller pirates have appeared off the North Sea coast. Charles Rockefeller himself is leading them, and they've just killed one of our colonels." Sora's blood ran cold. "Rockefeller pirates? Charles Rockefeller?" "Yes, sir. They've broken through our perimeter defenses and are demanding immediate support." "All right," Sora said, voice snapping into command. "Hold tight. I'm dispatching reinforcements now." He slammed down the handset and punched his palm on the alarm panel. An ear-splitting klaxon ripped through Marine headquarters. Sailors and officers leapt from their stations, scrambling toward the command center as red warning lights bathed the corridor. "Report," boomed Vice Admiral Fondo as Sora strode in, face set. Sora took a breath and gave the situation briefing in rapid-fire tones. "Pirate fleet under Rockefeller off the North Sea. They've already killed one of our colonels and want reinforcements. I'm ordering Task Force Alpha to intercept at grid coordinate N42. Simultaneously, inform Governor Charles at the mansion. He'll need to coordinate our coastal batteries." Around them, officers snapped to attention, issuing orders. Outside, the first ships of Beihai's naval flotilla were already sliding into the water. Charles Rockefeller's bold raid had ignited a full-scale emergency, and Beihai was moving to meet it head-on. Lieutenant General Darren let out a long, weary sigh and collapsed into his chair. Across the desk, Admiral Sokolsky's eyes burned with urgency. "Sir, we can't just sit here," Sokolsky pressed. "We need to take action immediately." Darren cast a tired glance at his colleague. "And do what exactly? Our enemy is Charles Rockefeller, the world's greatest swordsman, backed by the 4 legendary pirates. Even our best admirals wouldn't make it out alive." Sokolsky leaned forward, voice low but insistent. "Precisely why we can't afford to wait. Every day we hesitate while they tighten their grip on the North Sea." Darren rolled his eyes. He already knew everything Sokolsky had uncovered since arriving in the region, but he'd paid little attention. The entire North Sea was effectively his domain, and he'd grown used to commanding it from his desk. Let someone else deal with the problem, pirates. He was well aware of naval headquarters' frustrations. First, that the world government had forced him into this posting. Second, that his passive stance had allowed piracy to flourish. Still, he remained unmoved. At his age, risking his life for a battle he didn't believe in wasn't part of the plan. He was here to collect his salary and secure his retirement. Leaning back, Darren folded his arms. "Admiral, you can rally every ship in the fleet, but you won't chase Rockefeller Charles and his crew into oblivion. If HQ expects me to gamble my career on a doomed mission, they're welcome to recall me." Sokolsky's jaw clenched. "If we do nothing, then we do nothing," Darren interrupted, standing and picking up his cap. "I'll see you at the next briefing." Without another word, he strode out of the room, leaving Sokolsky staring after him, anger and disbelief warring on his face. Chapter Text: Headlines in Turmoil. It wasn't long before Admiral Sakasaki realized he had failed to gather the proof the world government demanded. With evidence lacking, and his superiors growing impatient, he knew his investigation would have to be called off, at least for now. But far from easing tensions, another development sent shockwaves through the North Sea: the sudden and extremely unwelcome arrival of the Rockefeller pirates. Governor Darren of the North Sea sat rigidly at his desk in Foxtail Palace, the official dispatch in his hand trembling ever so slightly. His face was ashen. Across the room, aides exchanged grim glances. Word had just come from the outer scouting stations. Rockefeller Charles himself, the world's greatest swordsman, infamous throughout the New World, had been spotted sailing straight into North Sea waters. Within minutes, every port city erupted in panic. Crowds flooded the docks, clamoring for news. Market vendors shouted rumors at the tops of their lungs. White fog dawn gave way to a frenzy of speculation. Could it really be him? Had the legendary pirate captain broken protocol and risked the world government's wrath by venturing into their territory? At the same time, far beyond the palace walls, news hawkers hawked today's papers on every street corner. The cover bore 2 screaming headlines. Rockefeller pirates appear in the North Sea. Rockefeller Charles himself sails these waters. The bulletin was courtesy of the Morgan's News Network, always quick on the draw. In fact, Morgan's reporters had learned of Charles's arrival even before Governor Darren, but the fleet of correspondents held their scoop until this exact moment, hoping to maximize its impact. Now that the cat was out of the bag, every copy flying off the presses only stoked public fear and excitement further. In his private study, Governor Darren crumpled the dispatch in frustration. If Rockefeller Charles truly intended to make landfall, if he planned anything more sinister than a simple survey, it would spell disaster not only for Darren's administration, but for the stability of the entire North Sea. Retreat, he decided, was no longer an option. The Rockefeller pirates had arrived, and with them came a storm that would test the very foundations of the world government's control. And so, amid the clamor of terrified citizens and the rustle of nervous pages turning, the North Sea braced itself. The age of Rockefeller Charles had come, and no one would emerge from it unchanged. How on earth did the Rockefeller pirates slip into the North Sea right under the Navy's nose? That headline blazed across every newsboard in Mary Joapan, igniting outrage among the city's most feared pirate elite. In a smoky back room of the Old Stars Hall, 5 of the organization's senior captains crowded around a battered bulletin nailed to the wall. Sa Tan Sheng, the veteran with the weathered tricorn perched crooked on his head, slammed his fist against the wood. Damn it. The Navy had this stretch of sea locked down tighter than a drum. How did they not see the Rockefellers coming? The others exchanged tense glances. They'd all been tracking the Rockefeller pirates' every move, yet had no clue how Charles Rockefeller, once dismissed as an incompetent upstart, had managed to breach the windless zone and emerge in the Nav, Wise hunting grounds. Shepherd 10, his blonde hair gleaming even by lantern light, tapped the paper thoughtfully. I refuse to believe Charles wielded some secret wind engineering technology. The windless belt is crawling with Neptunes, none of whom take kindly to human intruders. Any vessel caught there is torn apart before it's halfway through. Topman Vauchuri, his forehead marred by a crescent-shaped birthmark, scoffed. Then what's your explanation? You're not seriously suggesting Rockefeller flew in on some contraption of his own design. He can't even pilot a sloop properly. The room fell silent. Each captain stared at the grainy photograph of Charles Rockefeller printed alongside the story, his easy smile belying the elite flotilla he commanded. She must have had help, someone finally muttered. They didn't know it yet, but the Rockefeller pirates' true secret was only beginning to surface, and it would shake the entire North Sea to its foundations. I'll dispatch CP0 to keep an eye on Charles, Satan announced abruptly. What good will that do? One of the 5 elders with the sharp goatee, Marcus Mazeng, snorted. In the past 10 years, how many CP0 agents have you planted inside the Rockefeller pirates? Any of them ever completed their mission? They either vanish or get unmasked. Has Charles somehow developed lie detectors in his skull? Satan's eyes narrowed, but he forced himself to remain composed. All right, enough sarcasm. Now isn't the time for finger-pointing. We need a solution for Charles. I thought he was the quietest, most discreet among these pirate crews, but it turns out he's even more elusive than we feared. We have to take action. The eldest of the 5 elders, Izanbaron V. Langsheng, leaned forward, his voice low and measured. Right now, Marine Headquarters has every major asset committed to the New World. Garp is hunting the Roger pirates. Sengoku is tailing the flying pirates. Neither can be redeployed. The only operatives they can spare for this assignment are Sora and Sawa, operating under Law's direct orders. A heavy silence fell over the chamber as they contemplated the narrow options left to them, and the troubling intelligence they still lacked on the young pirate known as Charles. Fleet headquarters was tense. Maz Sheng leaned forward, tapping the polished table. Admiral Kong is tied up here at headquarters. He can't be spared. That leaves only Zephyr for the field. Vice Admiral Satan frowned. Zephyr, he's pulled back to the second line already. I doubt he'll take any real action. St. Vochuli snorted derisively. He still can't wrap his head around any kind of diplomacy. A calm voice cut through the murmurs. Nasi Sholangsheng, the fleet strategist. Let him try, he said. If his plan works, we gain the advantage. If it fails, we'll adapt and move on. Silence fell as the officers weighed the gamble and prepared for whatever Zephyr might bring to the battlefront. Chapter 284. Seconded. 5 of the old stars echoed in rapid succession. Peter Saint cleared his throat. Then we must prepare for the possibility that Zifa refuses to cooperate. Send in the Divine Guard to handle the Rockefeller pirates, St. Vauchuli snapped. Under no circumstances can Rockefeller, Charles, and Roger be allowed to roam free. That's a direct provocation against the world government. Silence fell across the chamber. With that, the council adjourned, and the orders flew straight to Navy headquarters, where another crisis was already unfolding. The Rockefeller pirates had slipped into the North Sea. "All right, everyone," Admiral Kong said, addressing the assembled officers. "The Rockefeller pirates have materialized in the North Sea. I want action plans, now." Officers exchanged anxious glances as they scanned the urgent intelligence bulletins. Finally, a lieutenant general rose to his feet. "Admiral, Marshal Sora, how did the Rockefeller pirates get past our defenses? Did they breach the calm zone?" Marshal Sora shook his head gravely. "We don't have confirmation of their exact route. Until we do, we can't be sure where they came from or where they're headed next." He paused, meeting each officer's gaze. "I want full reconnaissance reports within the hour and scouting squadrons dispatched immediately. Track every lead, no exceptions." Dismissed. As the officers filed out, the threat of Rockefeller Charles loomed larger than ever, and the hunt for the elusive pirates was officially underway. How they managed to get into the North Sea, I don't know, but one thing's certain, they've crossed the calm belt. Air exclaimed, eyes flashing with concern. Lieutenant Sora nodded slowly. "It makes sense. Charles disappeared right after passing by Wano country, and Wano sits on the edge of the calm belt. That's the only route." Commander Haru frowned. But how did he do it? If Charles simply used his own strength to break through, he must be stronger than we ever imagined. If he relied on some kind of technology, then the Navy is up against equipment that outclasses even Marine headquarters, maybe even the world government. A murmur rippled through the assembled officers. "And if the Rockefeller pirates get hold of that tech," Haru continued grimly, "they could let anyone ignore the calm belt's barrier. Ships would sail freely into any ocean. The entire world order at sea would collapse." Their voices trailed off, swallowed by the vast, restless waves. Then Sora's phone buzzed sharply. She glanced at the screen, took a steadying breath, and pressed it to her ear. Sora listened in silence, his expression grave. A full minute passed before he gently set the Den Mushi aside. Closing his eyes, he reached out mentally to the one man the world government still feared, retired Admiral Zephyr. "Admiral Zephyr," Sora began, voice low but firm, "the world government insists you resume active duty. They want you to take command of naval headquarters and crush the Rockefeller pirates." Zephyr's eyes snapped open. He fixed Sora with a weary glare. "You know, I've stepped back to train new officers," he said quietly. "I'm no longer interested in frontline commands." Sora's throat tightened. He understood Zephyr's reluctance, but orders were orders. "Sir, our manpower is nearly exhausted. Aside from me, you're the only one capable of stopping Charles inside the headquarters. We have no one else to turn to." For a moment, Zephyr said nothing. His gaze drifted to the holographic display hovering over his desk. There, in brutal detail, he saw his prize student Corporal Doberman, sword drawn, valiantly attacking, only to be cut down by Charles in a single stroke. The cadet's head fell, blood spattered the decks, Zephyr's jaw clenched. He remembered Doberman's tireless discipline, his unyielding hatred of pirates. A flash of grief, then steel entered the Admiral's eyes. He would answer the call, no matter the cost. He couldn't help but feel a pang of regret. This promising officer, whom he had once pictured rising to a mid-level command in the Marines, had fallen at the hands of Charles. Zephyr closed his eyes and recalled their very first encounter, barely 2 years ago. Back then, Charles was still known as Rockefeller Charles, a runaway boy making a name for himself on the high seas. Zephyr had hunted him from one port to the next, determined to bring him in. In less than 2 years, the boy's strength had skyrocketed, and he had the audacity to challenge Zephyr personally. Their duel ended in a draw. Neither man could claim victory, and Zephyr collapsed from exhaustion, only saved at the last moment by his own squadron. They met again months later, when Charles had already become one of the New World's most notorious pirates. Amid the chaos of a sudden clash between the two dominant pirate fleets, the Marine forces clashed with Charles's crew, and face-to-face with Charles himself. This time, the pirate's power was clearly on par with Zepha's, perhaps even poised to surpass it. Drawing a steadying breath, Admiral Zepha spoke softly to himself. "All right, this is my final shot. Win or lose, there will be no turning back." He stood, settled the marine coat over his shoulders, and walked out of the briefing room. In the hushed ranks behind him, the vice admirals and rear admirals watched their admiral depart, eyes alight with respect and resolve. Fleet Admiral Kong allowed himself a thin smile. At once, he ordered 3 vice admirals to shadow Admiral Zepha and deal decisively with the Rockefeller pirates. Were it not for most of the Navy headquarters forces being tied down elsewhere, the assignment would already have gone to the New World. Unfazed, Kong authorized a demon slaughter order, his own miniature buster call, to encircle and crush the Rockefeller crew. As soon as Zepha received the orders, word of the mission spread like wildfire. Morgan's intelligence network would see to that. On Marineford's sunlit terrace, Vice Admiral Garp and Fleet Admiral Sengoku lounged in floral print trunks, lemonade in hand, poring over the latest newspaper. "I never pegged Charles for this," Garp said, tapping the page with a grin. "He actually sailed into the North Blue. That's impressive." Sengoku leaned back, chuckling. "Let the Fleet Admiral chew on that for a while." Garp laughed, nearly spitting out his drink. "I can't wait to see Kong's reaction." Far from Marineford, somewhere in the roiling seas of the New World, Shiki the Golden Lion studied the dispatch in his hands. His eyes glowed with excitement. Charles's bold move had flung open a brand new avenue for him. Why remain trapped here, caught between pirates and marines? Why not strike around the entire globe? Shiki's heart thundered in his chest as he contemplated the possibilities. Chapter X, Chasing the Four Seas. Charles had been missing for nearly 2 months, and word finally reached Whitebeard's crew that he'd been seen in the East Blue, the weakest of all seas, and had somehow pushed on into the North Blue. A thunderous laugh shook the deck. "Ho ho ho, he actually made it to the North Blue. Unbelievable." Whitebeard, Edward Newgate, slammed his broad fist on the table. "Incredible. Young Charles has gone farther than anyone I've heard of in the East Blue." "Bai Shaoji," he called to his trusted lieutenant. "By the world government, we can sail all the world just like him." At the mention of a global voyage, the ever-spirited Kazuki Odin straightened up. "The Four Seas? That's no small matter." Newgate stroked his mustache, eyes alight. "I've never set foot in all 4 blues. Too much red tape from the world government. But that ends now. Once we conquer the New World, we'll chart a course through every one of the 4 seas. We'll re-enter the first half of the Grand Line via Fishman Island." He paused to look at the smiling faces of his sons. "What do you say, boys? Shall we make it happen?" "Long live father," they roared in unison. Even Odin, caught up in the excitement, threw his head back and cheered, unaware that the very Charles they so admire had once laid waste to his home. Far away, aboard a quiet merchant vessel, the red-haired Shanks folded his copy of the Maritime Journal with a wry grin. "So he's off to the North Blue. That boy never ceases to amaze." "Then when you return, it'll be on the date we agreed," Charles reminded him. The Red Earl folded up his newspaper and strolled toward the harbor. "The Whitebeard pirates passed through here not long ago," he remarked. "If we move quickly, we might still catch up." He boarded his sleek launch. With a roar of its engines, the boat surged forward and plunged into the open sea. Chapter 285, Dorag Peak deep in the North Sea, within the shadowed walls of a formidable castle. "Ha, Charles!" The roar of laughter echoed off Cold Stone as Dorag Peak, known throughout the underworld as the King of Assassins and one of the dreaded 6 emperors, glared down at the newspaper in his hand. His crimson eyes flickered with a familiar wrath. It had been 6 years since his carefully laid plans had collapsed. Back then, Dorag Peak had sworn vengeance on Charles, only to have his scheme exposed before it could even begin. In the ensuing chaos, his sprawling operations in the New World were all but eradicated, and the would-be executioner had been driven into ignominious retreat. 6 years ago, fresh from the land of endless war, Charles had learned that a bounty, placed by none other than Dorag Peak, hung over his head in the underworld. The King of Assassins had offered an enormous reward to anyone who could bring Charles's life to an end. Though Charles felt no fear, his own strength was still coalescing. He relied heavily on the fearsome reputation and resources of the legendary Rocks pirates. To keep his family safe, he forged a temporary alliance with them and drew on the tutelage of masters skilled in stealth and assassination. Now, as Dorag Peak poured over the headlines announcing Charles's growing power and influence, a cold smile spread across his lips. The old grudge had been revived. This time, he vowed, the outcome would be entirely different. Captain Charles of the 8th Squadron was a living legend, so formidable that he alone could fell the dreaded King of Assassins. So when Overlord Rocks learned that his prized captain had secretly accepted a bounty from a shadowy informant in the underworld, he was livid. A loyal subordinate of the late Locke, Rocks bristled at the idea of Charles taking a reward from anyone else. To prove his loyalty, and to remind the Dark Realm whose power truly ruled, Rocks ordered Charles to crush the King of Assassins once and for all. Under Charles's crisp command, the New World Overlord's fleet descended on the enemy's hidden strongholds with ruthless precision. The organ traffickers and death cultists who served the Assassin King never stood a chance. As the 8th Squadron smashed through black market dens and secret tombs, word of Rox's might spread like wildfire across the underworld. In barely a month, more than half of the Assassin King's lieutenants lay dead, their empire reduced to smoldering ruins. Yet the campaign's triumph came at a terrible price. Before the final blow could be struck, tragedy shattered the Rox pirates. Their master, Locke, was ambushed and killed in the untamed sea. News of his death ignited chaos among the ranks. Crews mutinied, captains vied for command, and ships deserted the fleet like burning embers. Stranded by sudden infighting, Charles and the remnants of the 8th Squadron watched helplessly as their hard-won victory unraveled. And the fate of the New World hung in the balance. Ever since rival factions in the underworld saw a chance to topple him, they'd used Dorag Killer King Peak's legendary name as a weapon. Rumors spread like wildfire through the New World, defaming him, chipping away at his power base until he inexplicably lost the vast markets he once dominated there. Only because he still held sway over the four seas, controlled the first half of the Grand Line, and commanded a legion of elite assassins did he avoid total ruin. And at the heart of it all was Charles. Dorag Peak's fingers snapped shut around the newspaper, crumpling it into a ball. The name Charles blazed in his mind, reigniting a cold fury that gnawed at his very bones. 6 years ago, the boy had been green and overconfident, barely aware of the world's true scope, and yet he had masterminded Peak's downfall from the shadows. Now, the Killer King swore he would have his revenge. "Master!" A young lieutenant dropped to one knee by Peak's side, eyes alight with anticipation. They're about to enter the kingdom of Ruvas. Shall we strike? Pike's gaze cut through the officer like a blade. The only sound in the silent cabin was his measured breathing. At last, with a voice as cold and unyielding as steel, he answered, "Prepare the flagship. Tonight, we send a message to anyone who dares threaten Dorag Peak." A murmur of approval rippled through the men present. Outside, the wind howled against the hull, and somewhere beyond the horizon, Charles pressed his own scheme ever closer to fruition, unaware that the Killer King had already set his trap. Peak's lieutenant hurried in, breathless. "Sir, the man we're up against is no ordinary pirate. He's the legendary super pirate Rockefeller Charles. The Navy's never managed to touch him. Even if they threw every ship they have at him, they'd come away empty-handed." Hearing that, Peak's earlier swagger, earned when he succeeded his father as the King of Assassins, vanished. He settled into his chair, expression cool. He knew their target's reputation for unmatched power, and that such strength made him nearly immune to intrigue. "Master," the lieutenant continued, lowering his voice, "I've picked up intelligence that the Navy's just dispatched Admiral Zifa to the North Sea specifically to deal with the Rockefeller pirates. This isn't a routine patrol. Zifa leaving headquarters is big news in the underworld. Everyone from smugglers to informants is buzzing about it." Pike's eyes gleamed. Admiral Zifa, known for the Black Arms Squadron, was one of the Navy's most formidable officers. If even he was being sent, it meant the Admiralty took Rockefeller Charles seriously. "So the Navy finally realizes what we already knew," Peak murmured. "They're sending their strongest to silence him." His lieutenant nodded. "Exactly. But this could work to our advantage. With Zifa occupied in the North Sea, we might exploit the distraction. Peak leaned forward, steepling his fingers. Then our plan is clear. We'll wait for Zepha's arrival to draw out Rockefeller Charles, then strike where he least expects. Prepare our best men. Tonight we take the first step toward toppling that pirate legend. Outside the dimly lit cabin, the waves slapped against the hull, as if echoing the storm that was about to break. Chapter 7. The Hunt Begins. In the grand war room of Gibraltar Palace, Minister Pierre's eyes glittered with determination. Deploy the Navy to deal with the Rockefeller pirates, he commanded. Track their every move. I want Charles under constant surveillance. Across the long mahogany table, Admiral Pieck inclined his head. At once, Minister. He tapped a hollow console, issuing orders to naval headquarters. All fleets, stand by for deployment. Outside the palace walls, on the deck of his flagship, Charles listened as a panting lieutenant delivered the news. Captain Charles, the Marines are closing in. They've begun monitoring our routes and communications. He set aside his half-empty glass of red wine and let his gaze drift to the flickering, hollow projector mounted on the bulkhead. A massive wanted poster filled the display. Rockefeller Charles Bounty, 30 billion berries, dead or alive, naval jurisdiction. A slow, confident smile curved Charles's lips as the crimson light of the projector danced across his features. 30 billion, huh? He murmured. They've been waiting a long time to make that decision. He tapped his comlink. Zepha, get your team ready. It's been 8 years since our last clash with the Marines. Let's give them a rematch they won't forget. A fierce gleam sparked in his eyes. He lifted his wine glass, the stem trembling in his grip with barely contained excitement. Plot a course to the Beihai governor's mansion, he ordered. All hands, prepare for immediate departure. We're about to show the Navy exactly why the Rockefeller pirates are the most feared crew on the seas. With that, Charles strode to the command console. The engines roared to life, and the flagship slipped from its berth. Ahead lay a gathering storm, both of wind and war, and Charles could hardly wait to meet E.T. head-on. Another major event is about to unfold, Vinsmoke Gage muttered, rubbing his forehead as he exhaled warily. Charles stood at the bow, gazing out where the cerulean sky met the rolling sea. Behind him, Elena's footsteps grew louder until she came to a halt at his side. Charles, she began, tone sharp with frustration, you promised we'd tour the Grand Line in peace, so why are you kicking up such a fuss now? Admiral Zepha has already been dispatched by the Navy. Did you even consider the consequences? Elena's eyes burned with disappointment. The Charles she once knew, gentle, cautious, had changed. Now he carried himself with unshakable confidence that often bordered on arrogance. He dared to sail into the world government's own backyard, taunting both Marines and high officials alike. Provoking the Navy was the last thing Elena had wanted. All she longed for was a quiet life, sharing calm days with the man she loved. Charles turned to her and offered a small, determined smile. Trust me, just one final spectacle, he said, sliding an arm around her shoulders. After this, I promise I'll keep us out of trouble. Elena sighed, frustration giving way to reluctant acceptance. I'd better be able to take that promise to the bank. She glanced toward the horizon as she spoke softly, more to herself than to him. First things first, we need to restock. Let's make for the kingdom of Ruas. At her words, Charles paused, then nodded. Ruas it is. Together, the trio adjusted the sails and set a new course, the excitement of the unknown beckoning them forward. Although Charles was eager to face Zepha, he didn't mind waiting a day or two. All right, he said, we'll dock at the kingdom of Luvas and rest for a few days. After all, we've been at sea for months. Elena gave a small, relieved smile at his decision. The moment Charles announced the plan, the entire crew burst into cheers. After drifting on the open ocean for so long, everyone was more than ready to set foot on solid ground again. Chapter 286, The Kingdom of Ruvas. Charles stared in awe at the sprawling sight before him. He had no memory of ever hearing about Ruvas, yet here it was, a vast kingdom of rolling fields, blooming gardens, and drifting clouds of perfume. From every vantage point, it seemed to celebrate beauty and abundance. As a proud member of the world government, Ruvas maintained strict trade regulations, and Charles realized his own ship, proudly flying the pirate Gol D Roger, was shouting trouble before he even docked. He motioned to his crew. "Lower the flag," he said calmly. "We'll approach as merchants." Within minutes, the black banner came down. The ship's sails were trimmed and repainted, the cannons discreetly stowed. By mid-morning, the vessel looked every bit a humble trading schooner, bound for business in Ruvas. Yet the North Sea was as lawless as ever. No sooner had they slipped into these waters than 3 separate pirate bands descended on them in the space of a single day. Each attack was brazen but poorly coordinated. Small raiding parties in fast sloops, clearly emboldened by the thought of plundering a laden merchantman. Charles and his crew met each assault head-on. Broadside volleys sent hulls shuddering, cutlasses clashed on deck, and within hours, each group of attackers lay in defeat. The battles were short but fierce, and every time the smoke cleared, the crew cheered louder, especially the 2 youngest members, Caesar and Tesla. Neither could resist scrambling over the conquered vessels, pockets jingling as they hunted for gold coins and glittering trinkets. By twilight, the last pirate had been driven off into the gathering fog. Charles examined his ship, a few splintered railings, patchable damage to the rigging, and a hold now crammed with spoils. He allowed himself a small smile. The disguise had worked well enough to draw out the opportunists, and even better, no one in Ruvas would spot a pirate flag for miles. "Set a course for the capital," Charles ordered. "We arrive at dawn." Below decks, Caesar and Tesla collapsed onto a stack of chests, exhausted but ecstatic. Outside, the wind whispered of new adventures. Ahead lay Ruvas's glittering shores, and the promise of fresh challenges in this fragrant kingdom. Caesar took the lead, Tesla brought up the rear, and between them scampered several 5- and 6-year-old brothers and sisters, all wide-eyed at the prospect of hunting pirate treasure. Every time one of the youngsters unearthed a bit of driftwood or a curious shell, they'd shriek with delight, and soon the whole crew was laughing. With this troop of pint-sized adventurers aboard, smiles never left the deck. By late afternoon, the black iron ship rounded the headland and dropped anchor off Ruiz Island. From the pier, crowds of dockworkers gaped as the unfamiliar vessel glided in. "What a huge ship," one of them marveled. "An iron ship, no less," another added, shading his eyes to get a better look. Charles leaned against the rail, rubbing his forehead. He'd hoped to slip in quietly. Clearly, that wasn't happening. The gangplank thudded onto the dock. Charles was first ashore. His sun-bleached hair still tumbled over his shoulders, but 2 precisely curled mustaches now framed his lips, lending him a surprisingly stern air. He turned to the rest of his crew, big and small alike. "Restock our supplies," he ordered, voice firm. "We'll be on Ruiz Island for the next few days." The children cheered and raced to follow, already chattering about their next discovery. Everyone on the pier held their breath as the sleek vessel pulled alongside the dock. First to disembark were a dozen armed men, their weapons at the ready and their bearing so formidable that laborers instinctively backed away. A stern-faced soldier strode forward from the crowd, his armor clinking with each step. His mere presence seemed to tighten the air around them. "Who are these people?" someone whispered. "They look unstoppable." "I've never seen a ship like this," another man added, eyes fixed on the hull. Polished, ebony planks curved into an elegant prow, and golden dragon motifs shimmered inlaid along its sides. Before the murmurs could die down, a group of women descended the gangplank. They moved with effortless grace, silk robes trailing behind them, jeweled hairpins glinting in the sun. Each face was more beautiful than the last, and every man on the quay felt his heart quicken. "Are they from Tianlong?" a fisherman wondered aloud. Nobody ever spoke of such splendor among their delegates. Standing amid the growing throng, Charles pressed a hand to his temple. He hadn't intended such a commotion. The women at his side exchanged faint, knowing smiles, subtle curves of their lips that only made the crowd lean in closer. If it were possible to hear a heartbeat across the wind, theirs would have sounded like rolling drums. Suddenly, the onlookers' awe shattered. A deep roar thundered down the pier. "Clear the way! Move, move, move!" From the end of the dock, a mounted officer charged forward, whip coiled in his fist. With each crack of leather on flesh, dockboards shuddered and splinters flew. Laborers stumbled aside, scrambling to clear the path, while the officer bellowed his orders over the echoing reverberations. Amid the chaos, Charles drew a steadying breath. What had begun as a simple landing was already transforming into something far grander and far more perilous than he'd ever imagined. Charles couldn't suppress a wry smile. Bullies seemed to spring up everywhere. Near the far end of the harbor, a small crowd pressed around a young nobleman. Clad in a platinum-trimmed doublet, he carried himself with princely bearing, chin lifted arrogantly, chest thrust forward. "Step aside! Haven't you heard? This is Lord Viscount!" One attendant snarled, shoving onlookers aside. Immediately, the crowd scattered. No one dared block his path. At last, the Viscount himself emerged. He swept his gaze across the dock and froze when his eyes landed on Charles. His jaw went slack. A thin line of drool trickled from one corner of his mouth. His heart thundered in his chest. The ladies in waiting at his side stifled giggles, exchanging amused glances as they took in the newcomer. "Such exquisite refreshments," the Viscount murmured, as though choosing fine wines for his cellar. Only he was sizing up Charles, as if for his personal retinue. Charles pressed a hand to his forehead. Of all people, the last one he wanted to impress was this arrogant noble, and judging by that pig-gilded expression, he was about to make a most unwelcome introduction. Charles bristled as the young page blocking the road waved at his two traveling maids. "Hey, outsiders!" the page called, voice dripping with arrogance. "You can't pass without paying toll. Just hand over those pretty ladies. I won't ask for much." "Who does he think he is?" Charles muttered, stepping forward. The page's smug grin only widened. "Insolent whelp," the page snapped. "Have you forgotten whose lands these are? It's the great Viscount's honor to claim these women for himself." At his side, a wiry squire lunged toward Charles, intent on enforcing the page's demand. "Show some respect, or else," the squire growled, raising a clenched fist. Charles held his ground. "Out of my way." "Kill him," the page barked. The squire surged forward, sword arm raised. But before the blade could fall, a clear clink of steel rang out. Sir Estes, captain of the Viscount's guard, stepped between them, twin swords flashing. In one fluid motion, he sliced through the squire's outstretched arm. In the next, he ran him through. The man collapsed in a spray of blood. Sir Estes sheathed his blades with calm precision and leveled a gaze at the stunned page. "Is this how you treat guests on the Viscount's roads?" The page paled, scrambling backward, as Charles watched the carnage in tense silence, relieved by the Guardian's timely intervention. "Kill them!" At Estesi's command, a dozen armored guards drew their swords and lunged forward. They were the sort who preyed on the weak, and within minutes Charles's thin company of swordsmen had cut them down to the last man. Only the noble retainers remained, paralyzed with fear, trembling among the butchered bodies. You have no right," the youngest Viscount stammered, his face ashen. "I am the Viscount of Ruvus," as Desi sneered at the boy and strode through the shallow pool of blood. The Viscount's eyes widened. He tried to back away, but his legs stiffened as though gripped by ice. "I will kill each and every one of you idiots," he howled. With a crack like shattering glass, unseen frost raced over him. In an instant, the Viscount's frozen form exploded into fragments that scattered across the courtyard. "Let's move," Charles said quietly, rising to his feet. He reached back and patted the empty air beside him, as if comforting an unseen companion. "Resupply our men and gather fresh provisions. Anyone joining us on the island must bring extra fighters. We rendezvous here at first light tomorrow." Taking his wife's hand and shepherding their children, he turned toward the city gates. Around them, stunned onlookers stood rooted to the ground, shivering at the brutal spectacle they had witnessed. "Who, or what, was that?" someone whispered, voice trembling. No one answered. All they could tell was that the sky itself had been torn apart. "Run! If the adults catch us, they'll never let us live this down," a panicked voice cried out. From the back of the group, a broad-shouldered youth stepped forward. "This isn't some minor mishap," he said gravely. "Too many have already died, and now a nobleman is involved." Chapter 287. The Kingdom of Perfume and Flowers. A warm breeze carried Charles and his little caravan into the bustling town square. All around them, street vendors hollered their wares over the lively clamor. Perfume, rose-scented perfume, flowers, gorgeous fresh roses, extra, extra, read all about it in today's paper. His entourage of wide-eyed children, most of whom had never ventured beyond their village, gazed at the scene in awe. Their mouths hung open as they took in the swirl of colors and the mingled scents of spices, blooms, and frying dough. Even the subtle hint of perfume in the air seemed like magic to them. At Charles's side, Elena, one of his young wives, could hardly contain her excitement. She tugged on his sleeve. "Charles, let's go see what's over there." He followed her pointing finger to a small wooden stall, surrounded by a throng of curious onlookers, ladies and young women pressing forward to catch a glimpse. Behind the counter stood a well-dressed vendor, his voice raised above the hubbub. "Step right up. This is the exclusive elixir I've perfected over 81 days. Not only will it repel mosquitoes and every other bothersome insect, it also banishes fatigue. Wear just one drop, and you'll stay alert, no rest for 3 days and nights, feeling as fresh as when you first applied it." Even before Charles and his family reached the stall, the vendor's promise of an all-powerful, long-lasting fragrance had captured their curiosity. Charles exchanged a grin with Elena and signaled the children to gather closer, eager to see what wonders awaited them in this fabled kingdom of perfume and flowers. Charles wove his way through the bustling fair with Elena and the others until they reached a perfumer's stall. The vendor gave a courteous nod as Charles selected a slender glass bottle and lifted it to his nose. A sharp, invigorating scent hit him like a blast of Arctic air, clearing every cobweb in his mind. He laughed aloud, feeling as though his soul had plunged into an ice cellar. Setting the vial back on the counter, Charles shot a playful look at Elena and their friends. "Sir, you've already sampled my perfume," he teased. "How can you resist buying it?" Without a word, the vendor, a sharply dressed man with keen eyes, picked up another bottle and inhaled deeply. He regarded Charles with a faint, approving smile. Charles produced a tidy stack of Bailey notes from his pocket. "Will this be enough?" he asked, sliding the money across the counter. The vendor's face glowed as he tucked the payment away. Nearby, a group of well-to-do ladies and debutantes had been watching the exchange. Their admiring glances followed Charles as he turned to face them, blissfully unaware of the effect his confidence was having. Just then, a melodious voice rang out above the murmur of the crowd. "Sir, you've certainly piqued my interest." A woman in an emerald green gown floated forward, leaving a soft trail of jasmine in her wake. The fragrance was so rich that Charles took an involuntary step back. She smiled, regal and composed. "I am the Duchess of Domodo. Might I tempt you to join me for a drink?" Charles met her steady gaze, intrigued by the unexpected invitation and by the thrilling possibilities the evening might hold. Charles had never backed down from a fight, not even against a legendary powerhouse like Whitebeard. Yet the moment the Duchess swept onto the scene, her mere presence forced him to take a hasty step back. That alone spoke volumes about her authority. Clearing his throat, Charles dipped into courtesy. "Your Grace, I'm grateful for your invitation, but I must respectfully decline." He forced a polite smile, knowing that his wife stood just behind him. No matter how gracious the Duchess's offer, they couldn't entertain it in public. The Duchess's lips curved into a frosty sneer. "Very well," she said, turning on her heel. "No, please, Your Grace, wait!" Charles called after her, but she was already striding away. The merchant at the booth, eager to placate one of his most valuable clients, howled out desperately as she left. He was met only with her retreating back. As her figure vanished into the crowd, Charles felt a mischievous impulse bubble up. "Your Grace," he shouted again, just for the thrill of it. Before he realized what was happening, small hands slid around his waist. Spinning around in surprise, he found Elena glaring up at him. "My little ancestor," he exclaimed. "What have you done this time?" Elena's scowl deepened, and Charles's grin faltered instantly. He slipped an arm over her shoulders in a mock embrace. "Come on, let's keep shopping. I can practically hear you plotting mischief." Elena huffed, but didn't offer any real protest. Side by side, they moved on to the next stall, the bustle of the market enveloping them once more. "You can buy whatever you like. I'll foot the bill," Charles declared, trying to sound nonchalant. In truth, his purse was empty, but he was certain his fortunes would turn any day now. He stared at the gleaming spires of Ruva's castle with undisguised envy. "Quick, quick!" A breathless knight burst into the courtyard, lowering his banner. "Lord Viscount has been murdered at the docks. We must inform the Prime Minister at once." A grizzled captain snapped to attention. Murdered? Then seal the harbor and apprehend the assassin immediately. Within moments, the city's defenses were mobilized. Armored pikemen and crossbowmen fanned out along the quay, searching every ship and dockside warehouse for suspects. The clang of steel and shouted orders echoed through the streets. Meanwhile, a few blocks away in the bustling market square, Charles browsed a stall's fine silks with a practiced air of indifference. He had just speculated, aloud of course, that he could afford the lot when a young man barreled into him, nearly knocking over the fabric. "Mr. Rockefeller Charles," the youth panted, thrusting a freshly printed newspaper toward him. "You're the world's greatest swordsman. How could we not recognize you?" Charles frowned, eyeing the ragged pamphlet. He'd encountered overzealous admirers before, especially back home on Kame Island, but this one was particularly persistent. With a patient sigh, he reached out to steady the fan's trembling arm. "Thank you," Charles said more politely than he felt, "but I'd rather be on my way." He slipped past, determined to finish his shopping before the city fell into chaos, or before his excited fan drowned him in questions. Either way, he suspected Ruvas had far bigger troubles tonight than one swordsman's autograph. Every time I strolled through Kame Island, I found myself surrounded by a group of sword and dagger-bearing admirers, all bowing in reverence and chattering with excitement. "Pardon us, great one," one of them blurted. "We thought you were the world's greatest swordsman. Our mistake." I shook my head. "Impossible. You saw my picture in the newspaper just yesterday." The young man's eyes widened. I reached up and fingered the fake beard I'd been wearing. It was still in place, and yet he'd recognized me immediately. "I know who you are," he said, voice trembling with excitement. "You're Sword Princess Rockefeller Estes." At that, he practically ran toward Esdeth, eager to make his introduction. But Esdeth merely gave him a cold glance, then turned away without a word. Irritated by the snub, I stepped forward. "All right," I snapped, tossing aside my beard. "My name is Charles. Now please, stop bothering us and be on your way." To my surprise, the young man dropped to one knee, bowed his head and whispered, "I'm sorry for the disturbance. I'll take my leave." And with that, he hurried off, still bowing as he went. "Can I have your autograph?" a young man called out. Charles spun around, gave the boy a thoughtful look, then turned back with a bright smile. He took the small notebook offered to him and swiftly signed his name. "There you go." "Thank you so much." The boy bowed deeply and hurried off. Charles watched him go, then turned to his companions with a lazy shrug. "See that? As the world's #1 swordsman, I've got fans everywhere." His friends exchanged amused glances, rolled their eyes, and returned to browsing the market stalls. They had been enjoying a leisurely shopping trip all morning. Their peace shattered in an instant. "Officer, it's him! He's the murderer who killed Lord Viscount!" A panicked voice rang out. In the next breath, armored soldiers poured into the square, one civilian frantically pointing at Charles. The lead soldier glanced at Charles and his friends, then barked, "Seize them! Bring them to the Prime Minister's chambers." "Yes, sir!" Spears were leveled as the troops closed in, surrounding Charles and his companions. Charles held his breath, expecting to see fear flicker in the girl's eyes, but none came. Instead, she met his gaze with a sly, mocking smile. Estes stepped forward, his expression ice-cold, a cruel grin spreading across his face. It was astonishing how threatening a child could appear. Chapter 288, Practical Training. Estes rose to his feet. One by one, Caesar, Tesla, and the other lieutenants followed suit. Tesla drew a short blade from his belt, eyes cold and determined. Nearby, Robert, Sif, and Dedala crouched low, their faces split by eager smiles. "Kill!" Estes's command rang out. In an instant, they charged. Caesar's form blurred, half man, half dragon, claws gleaming dangerously in the sunlight. Robert raced close behind, pumping his fist in excitement. "Ha! Let's show them what Uncle Robert can do." Robert inhaled deeply, channeling his devil fruit power. With a roar, he unleashed a rolling wave of toxic gas. The sickly green cloud surged over the first rank of soldiers. Men clutched their throats, eyes watering uncontrollably, as the poison burned through their lungs. Their screams choked off into gurgles as they collapsed, writhing in pain. "Gas burst," Dedala echoed, lifting her small hands. A secondary plume of poison blossomed at her fingertips, seeping outward to swallow the next wave of troops. Sif darted after them, blades drawn, cutting down anyone still standing between the gas clouds. Tesla met her charge, spinning his short knife in a graceful arc. Every move was precise, every strike fatal. Charles watched from a short distance, arms crossed. He'd always believed that shielding his children from the brutality of battle would weaken them. Instead, they'd grown up alongside death, unflinching, unafraid. Even he remembered trembling at his own first kill. These children, his children, fought stronger and more ruthlessly than he ever could at their age. The field stank of iron and poison, littered with fallen soldiers. Yet Robert, Sif, and Daedala stood unharmed, their breaths steady, their eyes bright with exhilaration. Estes signaled them to regroup. "Excellent," he said, voice low but firm. That was only the beginning. Everything that came into contact with Daedara's body detonated in a violent burst. Swords shattered, shields splintered, and soldiers were torn apart in mid-stride, the force so immense that no corpse was left intact. Terror rippled through the narrow street, and the surviving defenders fled in all directions. When another 100 members of the city guard arrived, they too were cut down almost instantly by the combined power of Estes and Caesar. With a whoosh of displaced air, Robert swooped in, shifting back into his human form as he landed before them. Arms crossed, he scowled at the devastation. "Humph. You two didn't leave a single soul for Robert and me to fight, not nearly enough to satisfy us." Estes offered a rare, genuine smile, one he reserved only for his younger siblings. Gently, he reached out and tousled Robert's hair. "You want to fight, do you? Don't worry, little brother. There'll be plenty of chances in the future. You're still too young for a real battle against so many." Even Charles, who seldom saw Estes relax, felt the warmth of that smile. In Estes's dealings with him, Charles had never glimpsed anything but cool formality, so much so that he'd once worried he'd somehow offended him. A ripple of applause suddenly broke the tension. Charles stepped forward, clapping politely as he masked his unease beneath an outward show of enthusiasm. "Good work." Charles beamed at Robert and Daedara. It was their first real fight, yet they'd outperformed every expectation, playing to their strengths, neutralizing the enemy with surgical precision, and emerging unscathed. That was praise well earned. At his words, Robert and Daedara exchanged triumphant grins, their rivalry shining through as they nudged shoulders like victorious roosters. But at the edge of the group, Sif's face fell. She'd been itching for her moment in the fray, only to hesitate when the barrel of the gun had glinted too menacingly. Charles didn't notice his second daughter's disappointment. Ruffling Robert's hair and clapping Daedara on the back, he swept a hand across the deserted street. "Let's keep moving. There's more to scavenge." Behind them, over 100 bodies lay strewn across the pavement. Kill or be killed. In this cannibal-haunted world, only the strong earned the right to live. That harsh truth had been Charles's first lesson to all his children, drilled into them from the day they could walk. And now, as they stepped over the fallen, he knew they were finally ready. Charles's ambush had the exact effect he intended. The initial skirmish in the street drew the attention of a fresh detachment of pursuing soldiers. They hurried along the same route, determined to cut off his retreat. Instead, they walked straight into Charles's trap, and were cut down by his young protégés without mercy. This was no accident. Charles had orchestrated every detail to sharpen his wards into killers. His sole command to them was simple: kill unceasingly, regardless of motive. As they advanced, the bodies piled up behind them like fallen dominoes. By evening, the day's relentless fighting had taken its toll. Estes, Robert, and Daedara, still green behind the ears, had engaged the enemy in 2 brutal encounters and were utterly spent. They collapsed to their knees, unable to draw another breath. Estes fared better. In the long afternoon, he had personally dispatched over 1,000 soldiers. His sword arm twitched with residual adrenaline, but he too was approaching his limit. And then there was Caesar. Charles watched him with grudging admiration. After hours of slashing through ranks of foes, Caesar showed no sign of fatigue. A quick bite of roasted meat from a street vendor, and he bounded back into battle, fresh as dawn. Of the 400 soldiers they'd faced, 250 had fallen to Caesar's blade alone. His unflagging stamina, his boundless drive, it was a sight that left Charles both impressed and envious. Yet, as he surveyed the carnage and inspected his exhausted comrades, He knew the real lesson was just beginning. This crucible of blood and steel was forging warriors, and he would push them even harder tomorrow. By late afternoon, the city was in open panic. Word had spread of a sudden, devastating attack. The city's defense forces were overwhelmed, their soldiers dropping one by one with no sign of the enemy. Desperate for news, the commander sent an urgent report to the palace. A breathless aide bowed before the Prime Minister's desk. "Your Excellency, over 3,000 of our men have been killed, and we still don't know who struck us." Prime Minister Thornborough sat rigidly behind his mahogany desk, staring in disbelief. 3,000 in a single afternoon? Do you realize how grave this is? Our entire kingdom numbers scarcely 60,000 souls. Such losses, it's unthinkable. The general, standing at attention, met his gaze. "We have no identification, sire. The enemy appears out of nowhere, strikes without warning, then vanishes." "Useless," Thornborough spat, sweeping every paper and inkpot from the desk in fury. The clatter echoed off the stone walls. "I want fresh reports. Cross-reference every scout's account, every patrol log. Leave no lead unexplored." At that moment, the secretary hurried in, clutching a sealed dispatch. He placed it before the Prime Minister and bowed. Thornborough forced himself to calm, broke the seal, and unfolded the letter. His face blanched as he read the contents, eyes widening in shock. What he saw was far worse than even these horrific losses. "The Rockefeller pirates from the New World are off our coast, and they could land in Ruvas at any moment." Prime Minister Aldrich slammed his palm down on the council table. Though he'd never faced the Rockefeller pirates in person, he knew of their reputation, the only force the world government has ever failed to subdue. Just days ago, newspapers had blazed headlines about their sudden appearance in the North Sea. Now they hovered at Ruvas's doorstep. A shiver ran through the chamber as everyone recalled the fate of those 8 ill-fated kingdoms in the New World, completely wiped out by the Rockefeller pirates' ruthless advance. Only a tenuous agreement with the world government had spared the surrounding territories from permanent occupation. If these pirates set foot on Ruvas, the kingdom could share the same grim destiny. General Harrow, standing before the Prime Minister, frowned deeply. With a precise motion, he withdrew a sealed bounty notice from his uniform and placed it beside a freshly delivered sketch from his scouts. Both images showed the same distinctive mark, a jagged scar running down the man's right cheek, and that crooked, malicious grin. "Prime Minister," Harrow said in a low voice, "this is one of the Rockefeller lieutenant's known faces." He tapped the reward poster, 15 million berries for a single pirate. The sum itself carried more weight than any argument. A tense silence fell over the council. 15 million berries for one lieutenant. The cost of stopping even a fraction of this crew was staggering. Aldrich drew in a steadying breath and straightened his robes. "Alert every northern watchtower," he commanded. "Dispatch messengers to our coastal forts. Prepare the garrisons for immediate action. Ruvas must not suffer the same fate as those lost kingdoms." The officers snapped to attention at his orders. Outside, a cold wind swept around the palace spires, as if heralding the storm about to break over the kingdom of Ruvas. She strode into the council chamber with her blonde hair cascading over a gleaming platinum uniform and that unmistakable upturned smile on her lips. "Prime Minister, the Rockefeller pirates have reached the island," the breathless aide cried, stumbling to a halt at the head of the long table. The general, seated beside the Prime Minister, snapped to attention. "What?" he demanded, his voice echoing off the marble walls. The Prime Minister stared from the general to the 2 photographs still clutched in the officer's trembling hand. His eyes narrowed, pupils shrinking to pinpricks as alarm and disbelief warred on his face. Chapter 289, Lieutenant General Darren's Panic. "It's over. It's over. In my hands, the kingdom of Ruvas will be destroyed." Prime Minister Aldrich's voice cracked as his legs gave out beneath him. He slid from his chair, clutching the freshly delivered wanted poster. The face staring back was unmistakably Charles, only now adorned with a heavy beard. Aldrich collapsed to his knees before Lieutenant General Darren, arms outstretched. "General, quick, summon the Bay High Navy." Darren's heart pounded. If Charles truly led the Rockefeller pirates, Ruvas stood on the brink of annihilation. "Right away, Your Excellency," he said, striving to keep his voice steady. He dashed out of the mansion and into the courtyard, issuing rapid-fire orders to his aides. All city defense units, fall back to the walls. This is an immediate full recall. Helmets were donned, armor rattled, and soldiers scrambled into formation. Without pausing, Darren climbed onto the telegraph platform and grabbed the receiver. "Moses, Moses," he shouted into the mouthpiece. "This is the Kingdom of Ruvus. The Rockefeller pirates have landed on our shores. We request immediate naval support from the Beihai fleet. Coordinates to follow. Time is of the essence." His roar rippled through the barracks. Nervous recruits snapped to attention as messengers sprinted off. Moments later, the reply crackled back. "Beihai Governor's Mansion acknowledges receipt. Reinforcements mobilizing now." Darren stared at the handset, the weight of the kingdom's fate pressing down on him. The coming hours would test every ounce of Ruvus's resilience and his own leadership to the breaking point. General Davenport's jaw clenched as the crackling voice came through the console. "Sir, Admiral Zepha's dispatch is arriving now from Navy headquarters." Davenport slammed his palm onto the desk. "How long before he lands?" The communications officer frowned, glancing at the readout. "Approximately 1 month, sir." 1 month, Davenport echoed in disbelief. He let the handset slip from his grasp. It hit the floor with a metallic clatter. His face went ashen. "In a month, the Kingdom of Ruvus will be at the bottom of the sea," he snarled. "All that heavenly gold? Was it meant to rot underwater? This isn't a gift for you to squander. I'll report this to the world government." He would have thrown something in his fury, but there was nothing left to hurl. Instead, he stared up at the low-ceiling command room in frozen dread. "It's over. We're finished." A tremor ran through him, and he sprang to his feet. "No! Get out of here! Right now! It's too dangerous to stay!" Images of the Rockefeller pirates flashed through his mind, their feral reputation, the rumors of entire fleets disappearing at their approach. Terror propelled him down the corridor before he could change his mind. He wouldn't wager even the finest veteran soldiers against that name. In the gilded halls of Beihai Governor's Palace, a naval communications sentry hovered anxiously over the receiver until the line went dead. With a crisp salute, he raced into Lieutenant General Darren's study. "Sir," he panted, "I have urgent news about the Rockefeller pirates." Lieutenant General Darren looked up from the map spread across his desk, his expression grave. "Proceed," he said, steeling himself for whatever fresh catastrophe waited just beyond the horizon. The Rockefeller pirates' fleet thundered onto the shores of the Kingdom of Ruvus, cannons roaring and sails snapping in the wind. On the deck of the flagship, Charles, once called Charlotte, stared at the smoke rising over the fortress walls, bewilderment etched on his face. Attack Ruvus? When had he given such an order? Deep within Ruvus's capital, Lieutenant General Darren whirled around as his aide burst into the council chamber. "Sir, the Rockefeller pirates have just bombarded our coastal defenses." Darren's heart skipped a beat. "What? They've attacked Ruvus? Don't they know Ruvus is a member of the world government? Are they trying to pick a fight with the entire organization?" He staggered toward his ornate desk, fingers digging into its polished surface. Directly assaulting a world government ally was tantamount to declaring war, something only the most notorious pirate emperors of the New World might dare. Yet here they were, the Rockefeller pirates, feared above all others in the Grand Line, had carried out this brazen strike. Darren slid into his gilded chair, eyes wide with dread. "No," he whispered to himself. "We can't just sit here and wait to be crushed. If they'll attack Ruvus today, what's to stop them from coming for the Beihai Governor's Mansion tomorrow? Will I even live that long?" His pulse thundered in his ears. The walls of safety he'd always known were crumbling. Then, bang! A decisive rap at the door shattered his spiraling thoughts. Whatever lay beyond that panel of wood would change everything. Lieutenant General Darren jerked upright in his seat. He'd thought the Rockefeller pirates had suddenly appeared at his doorstep until he realized the man standing before him was not a pirate raider, but Major General Sokolsky of Naval Headquarters. "Major General Sokolsky," Darren barked, "did you never learn to knock before entering an officer's private quarters?" Sokolsky's dark eyes narrowed, as though he were restraining laughter. "My apologies, Lieutenant General," he said, inclining his head in a crisp Navy salute. "Word came in about the pirates, and Well, I let my urgency get the better of me. He scanned the room once, then turned his gaze back to Darren. I believe you have the latest intelligence packet on the Rockefeller pirates. With a swift motion, he extended a gloved hand. Darren exhaled and eased a heavy wooden dossier across the desk. Here it is, sir. Every scrap of information we've gathered. The moment Sokolsky lifted the cover, the temperature in the room seemed to spike. Darren's eyes darted around for a sign of fire or explosion, but there was nothing, only the unsettling heat that radiated from Sokolsky himself. Cold sweat beaded at Darren's temple. He swallowed hard. It was easy to forget that Major General Sokolsky answered directly to Admiral Zephyr, one of the most formidable figures in the Imperial Navy, and no one in their right mind crossed Admiral Zephyr without paying the consequences. As Sokolsky began leafing through the reports, Darren forced himself to stand motionless, his trembling hand pressed firmly behind his back. There was no margin for error now. Everything depended on how he'd compiled this briefing. Under the watchful eyes of Zephyr's chosen general, one misstep could be fatal. Lieutenant General Darren, I request permission to go to the Kingdom of Ruvus and keep watch on the Rockefeller pirates. Darren looked up, anger flashing in his eyes. You want to spy on the Rockefeller pirates in Ruvus? At your current strength, you'd be walking into a death trap. We'll discuss this when Admiral Zephyr returns. Charles squared his shoulders. I won't back down. If anything happens to me, I'll take full responsibility. He turned on his heel and strode out of the governor's office without waiting for a reply. Charles, you damn fool, do you still think of me as your superior? Darren shouted, but Charles didn't look back. His boots clicked steadily down the corridor as he headed for the harbor. Chapter 7. As a major general, Charles commanded his own warship, so heading to sea was never a problem. He strode onto the quarterdeck and called out to his first mate, Ghost Spider. Set course for the Ruvus Kingdom. The Rockefeller pirates have been reported there. Ghost Spider didn't hesitate. Ever since serving under Commander Sakaski, he and Charles had shared the same ideals, until the Rockefeller pirates struck and killed their comrade, Doberman. Ghost Spider still burned with anger over that loss, and now, united with Charles, he was determined to settle the score. Within hours, they reached the port city in the Ruvus Kingdom. Under a blood-red sunset, Charles led his officers into a waterfront tavern for dinner. But word of the Rockefeller pirates' brutal raid, only an hour earlier, had spread through the streets. The townspeople cowered behind shuttered doors, and no one dared serve Charles's men. They waited. An hour passed. Still no food, no fresh recruits arrived. No one would face training that afternoon. Charles tapped his fingers on the table, irritation flaring. Their killing training was notorious for its severity, brutal drills designed to weed out the weak. Many had died, but those fated to fall would at least meet their end quickly, sparing them long suffering. Beyond that cruelty, the survivors emerged stronger, hardened for the battles ahead. Finally, as dusk deepened, a lone messenger slipped in. Charles stood, his patience at an end. Tonight, he'd learn whether the Rockefeller pirates had truly overrun Ruvus, or if this was merely another ploy to stall him. Either way, Charles vowed he would not be held at bay. The hunt for vengeance and justice was just beginning. After more than 10 years on the road, Charles had grown noticeably harder. Outside his family and closest friends, respect for life had become a rare luxury. Over time, his soft side all but disappeared. He reserved kindness only for those he truly cared about. Get some rest, Charles said, casting a careful glance around the camp. We leave tomorrow. We're not welcome in this city. Chapter 290. Chaos in the North Sea. Charles wasn't in the mood to browse the market stalls any longer. After last night's upheaval, he knew the townspeople would soon realize a demon had invaded their kingdom, one who had led his men in a brutal assault on the royal army. There was no point in lingering here. Once Lowell finished gathering the supplies they needed, they would set sail. Staying meant only drawing more attention. No one argued. Under the strained hospitality of the innkeepers, they sampled the town's local delicacies, but their appetites had fled. The children, everyone but Caesar, were so exhausted they could scarcely lift a spoon. Night descended quietly, granting them an uneventful if fitful rest. At dawn, the travelers emerged onto empty streets. Just as Charles had predicted, Every shutter was closed. Each cobblestone lane lay deserted. The aftermath of the demon's raid had terrified the townsfolk into hiding. Charles and his companions made their way toward the port, their footsteps echoing in the stillness. Whenever a stray glimmer of movement caught a villager's eye, they bolted indoors, glancing back with fear painted across their faces. Charles paid them no mind. Their panic was merely the lament of the weak, and he had a voyage to resume. With Lowell now stocked with provisions, the time for delay had passed. Ahead lay the North Sea, churning with its own brand of uncertainty. But Charles had weathered worse storms than that. He squared his shoulders, steeled himself against the unknown, and strode on toward the waiting ship. Back on deck, the swordsmen were assembled and ready, all eyes on their captain. Charles waved his hand with a grin. "All right, everyone. Set sail for the next island." He'd already decided to stop at each port for exactly 1 day and throw a grand banquet. Maybe it was a bit impulsive, but as captain, he could call the shots, and his crew had little choice but to go along. A few days later, Charles lounged in the captain's chair, idly flipping through the day's newspaper. His eyes snapped wide. "When did I destroy the kingdom of Ruvas?" The headline blazed across the page, "The Rockefeller Pirates. First North Sea engagement kingdom of Ruvas obliterated." Below, the article recounted in vivid detail how Charles had supposedly led the assault that annihilated Ruvas, then offered background on the long-fallen kingdom. Charles stared at the ink as if it might rearrange itself into a more sensible story. When had any of this happened? Why was he the only one left out of the loop? Before he could puzzle it out any further, Barrett, his first mate, hurried over, breathless. "Captain, we've got a warship on our tail. Looks like the Navy's surveillance corvette." Charles snapped the newspaper shut. "Well," he said, slipping it into his coat pocket, "it seems we have more urgent business than banquets." He strode to the helm. "Full speed ahead, and let's see what they want." Since dawn, a world government warship had been tailing them at a discreet distance. The moment Barrett spotted its familiar silhouette on the horizon, he knew something was up. "Don't sweat it," Charles said with a lazy shrug. "We're in the North Sea now, the Navy's own backyard. If they weren't keeping an eye on us, I'd start to wonder what they were doing with their lives." Darren scratched his head. "Who exactly are you scolding?" Charles waved him off. Naval surveillance was all too routine these days. He'd long ago grown used to being shadowed by warships. Barrett let out a relieved breath at Charles's indifference, but he still stationed an extra lookout on deck. He didn't dare mention that their pursuer was Admiral Sakazaki's flagship. Sakazaki being a rising star destined for great things in the Navy. If Charles ever found out, Barrett was certain he wouldn't be so nonchalant. After all, eliminating an admiral in the making would have serious repercussions. This kind of wary vigilance had become second nature on the sea god Poseidon. For over 10 days straight, every time the ship approached an island, Charles ordered a full-day stop to resupply, throw a feast, and hunt for whatever treasures might be hidden ashore. The crew had grown accustomed to the routine, but Barrett knew better than to let his guard down. Chapter 7. A Banquet on the Island. It was a joy for Charles to spend his days playing with his family and the younger children. There was no sense of impending battle, no urgency to cut short their laughter. Charles wasn't yet ready for Teacher Zepha's arrival, so he allowed himself the luxury of simple pleasures, beach games, storytelling beneath the palms, and carefree afternoons. Still, he insisted that every child finish the morning drills and sparring exercises he'd carefully arranged before they were free to romp and explore. The 5- and 6-year-olds grumbled at times, but none dared defy his stern smile. Somewhere beyond the reef, however, trouble was stirring. High above the waves, Sakaski's swift sloop followed the Rockefeller pirates at a safe distance. For 10 days he had watched their every move, from dawn till dusk feasts on one secluded isle to candlelit banquets at another. Pirates by name, perhaps, but these men and women seemed more intent on hosting lavish parties than on pillaging merchant ships. "What on earth are the Rockefeller pirates up to?" Sakaski muttered, leaning over the rail to peer at the distant lantern-lit beach. "They spot an island and immediately throw a banquet? They're not pirates at all." Despite his puzzlement, a reluctant relief settled in Sakaski's chest. If these so-called pirates truly meant to attack a kingdom, he would have to step in, no matter the cost. Fortunately, they showed no signs of real aggression, at least for now. He turned to the ghostly spider perched on the mainmast, a silent companion on this shadowing mission. The creature's 8 gleaming eyes reflected the lantern glow as Sakazuki asked, voice low with urgency, "How long before Teacher Zephyr arrives in Beihai?" The spider paused, its spindly legs tensing, as if weighing the answer. In that pregnant moment, the gentle clamor of Charles's Island Festival felt worlds away, and the calm before a storm. The governor's mansion dispatch has reached Reverse Mountain and is about to enter the North Sea, announced the ghost spider. Hearing that, Sakazuki let out a low sigh of relief. He was known for his ruthless efficiency against pirates. Few ever escaped his grasp, but he also knew when to pick his battles. The Rockefeller pirates he faced now were simply beyond his current strength. Though every fiber of him itched to strike them down, he held back his forces and remained hidden. "Rockefeller pirates," he murmured, "your reckoning draws near." In Sakazuki's mind, the moment Admiral Zephyr arrived in North Blue, Charles Rockefeller would fall. He couldn't fathom Admiral Zephyr ever being bested. Having never witnessed the world's truly elite fighters, he had no benchmark for ultimate power, only the unshakable belief that Zephyr, fresh from the academy and untested in real combat, was invincible. No pirate, he was certain, could survive even a single blow from the Admiral. Below deck, Elena stirred her tea as she warmed herself beside the small brazier. Sparks danced up into the night air, and she glanced over at Charles, who sat lost in thought. "Charles," she said quietly, "General Zephyr is heading to North Blue soon. Aren't you at all worried?" Charles's voice rang out, brimming with confidence. "What are you afraid of? With me here, Zephyr hasn't a chance of catching me. If you truly want to seize me, you'll need Carp and the warring states working together. Zephyr alone is no match." Elena exhaled in relief. She had no desire to see upheaval within their family. After all, it was Charles's leadership that held the Rockefeller pirates together. If he fell, their future would be bleak indeed. Meanwhile, atop Upside-Down Mountain, "Through this pass lies the North Sea," the battle commander announced, his voice carrying on the wind. "The region has been thrown into turmoil ever since the Rockefeller pirates, under Charles Rockefeller's banner, reappeared on the horizon. Pirates are growing bolder by the day, and the North Sea Navy, once the dominant force, remains bottled up in port." Below them, 5 warships carved a path down the mountain's steep slopes, setting course for the infamous starting point of the Grand Route. At the prow of the lead ship stood a man whose broad shoulders and unyielding posture made him look as solid as an iron tower. Just behind him, an elderly lieutenant general leaned forward, reporting the latest North Sea intelligence to Admiral Zephyr. Since the Rockefeller pirates burst onto the scene, nearly every warship in the North Sea has been dispatched to hunt them down. In effect, Charles has become the Imperial Navy's obsession, drawing all its strength toward him and leaving the rest of the sea lanes dangerously exposed. Sensing opportunity, every minor pirate crew has begun carving out its own swath of territory. At the Beihai governor's mansion, reports of these developments have been arriving in a steady stream. Zephyr sits in his study, rifling through dispatches and intelligence briefs. His eyes settle on the latest wanted poster. "Rockefeller Pirates, Captain Charles, male, 50,000 gold reward." Zephyr leans back in his chair and lets out a low chuckle. "Charles," he murmurs, "you've certainly stirred the pot." Chapter 291. The War in the North Sea. Zephyr could still taste the bitterness of defeat from 7 or 8 years ago. He'd been beaten by a band of rookie pirates with barely 2 or 3 years on the waves. Both sides had suffered heavy losses, but in the end, he had lost. And a loss is a loss, no matter how you spin it. He never admitted it aloud, yet the disgrace had gnawed at him ever since. Before his wife died, he'd seized every opportunity, real or imagined, to challenge Charles again, but the shifting tides of politics always pulled him back. When she passed, his drive for vengeance seemed to die with her. He had almost let the dream slip away entirely until today. Fate, it seemed, had given him another chance. "Charles, we fight once more." Zephyr's voice rang out across the still waters as he clenched his fist. This time, the Navy had come prepared. 3 massive warships loomed on the horizon, each under the command of a lieutenant general. At their head stood Lieutenant General Darren, governor of the North Sea. Together, their fleet boasted enough firepower to crush any pirate horde that dared show its face. But as the hours ticked by, the expected battle never came. In the port of Beihai, tension coiled in every alley and tavern. Word spread like wildfire. The navy was here. One by one, even the most hardened pirates melted into the shadows, unwilling to wager their lives against such overwhelming force. Without Charles at the helm of the pirate fleet, the moment slipped through Zepha's fingers. He paced the deck, heart-pounding, unwilling to let his second chance vanish, just as the first had. Admiral Zepha the Black's flagship cleaved the gray waves of the North Sea, a region infamous for lawlessness and pirate uprisings. No sooner had his fleet entered these waters than lookouts spotted a ragged squadron of corsairs bearing down on an unarmed merchantman. With barely a flicker of hesitation, Zepha issued the order, engage. Within minutes, the Black Armada bore down on the pirates. How could these ragtag crews, barely worth 10 million Baileys in total plunder, hope to stand against Zepha's ironclad warships and precision gunners? In swift, brutal succession, more than a dozen pirate vessels were sunk or scattered. Their black flags were hauled down in panic. Their survivors slipped into hidden coves, waiting for the admiral's ships to pass. They knew why Zepha had come. Rumors of the Rockefeller pirates were whispered in every dockside tavern. But these lesser outlaws were no more than a nuisance, worthy of fear perhaps, but not of pursuit. All was calm again, save for the rolling sea and the creaking timbers of Zepha's fleet. Above the waterline, rows of massive warships formed an iron wall, their smaller gunboats scouting the distant horizon. On the deck of the Dark Justice, Admiral Zepha stood motionless, his dark coat billowing in the salt wind. "General Zepha!" Captain Sikorsky broke the silence, snapping to attention at his side. "At ease, Sikorsky," Zepha replied with a curt nod. He turned his steely gaze to the horizon. "Report, where have the Rockefeller pirates been sighted? And, what of Charles?" Sikorsky drew out a map, fingertips tracing the marked currents. "Sir, our last intelligence places them near Blackstone Reef, 10 leagues to the southeast." Admiral Zepha stood on the quarterdeck, flanked by 3 vice-admirals from Navy headquarters and the vice-admiral of the North Sea Governor's Branch. Beside him, Sikorsky hesitated a moment before reporting, "Admiral Rockefeller Charles has anchored his fleet at an uninhabited island. It looks like he's daring us to come ashore." "A deserted island?" Zepha repeated, both surprised and annoyed. "That's audacious." He remembered when Charles had first appeared on the Navy's radar, a mere upstart swordsman hardly worth their attention. Yet in the years since, that little guy had grown into a force capable of facing the Navy head-on. Inviting them to attack him on his own ground, what a challenge. "Very well," Zepha said, steeling himself. "Signal all ships to get underway. Let's see if this self-styled world's greatest swordsman really can stand against the full might of the Navy." At his command, the fleet slipped its anchors. Under Zepha's flag sailed 4 vice-admirals, 5 rear-admirals, and a cadre of captains, nearly 2,000 officers and men ready for battle. With the wind at their backs, they headed straight for the uninhabited island where Charles awaited, swords in hand. The Demon Slaughter Order's strength was unmistakable, and here, on a desolate island in the North Sea, its power was on full display. All around the shore, ships of every size prowled the waters, vessels sent by rival North Sea powers, including a flotilla from Morgan's news agency. "Ha! Now this is big," Morgan's crowed as he stormed onto the island, flanked by a swarm of reporters snapping photographs. "The Rockefeller pirates have squared off with an admiral. This is earth-shattering news." He swept his gaze over the scene. Foo. Could that be the swagger of the world's greatest pirate? He mused aloud, excitement dancing in his eyes. Barely 10 years old, the boy in question had already founded the Don Quixote family in Beihai with the backing of Torrepolder, an audacious bid to reclaim his celestial dragon heritage after a failed attempt on his father's life. No one had imagined such dramatic upheaval in the North Sea. The sudden rise of the Rockefeller pirates had sent shock waves through every power block. Now every faction had turned its gaze to this island, eager to see what move the young pirate lord would make next. Adjusting his glasses with deliberate slowness, Doflamingo stared at the lone figure pacing the shoreline. A cold, triumphant smile curled his lips as he whispered to himself, "World government, foo-foo-foo. Celestial dragons, foo-foo-foo-foo-foo. The Navy, foo-foo-foo-foo." The sneer on his face said it all. Rejected by the Holy Land, Doflamingo felt utterly disillusioned with the world. All he wanted now was to watch it burn, and everyone in it. Yet the man standing before him offered a dangerous glimmer of hope. "Dover," Doflamingo said, voice low and electric. "This man is the most feared pirate in the New World. Are you certain we should ally ourselves with him?" Torobol broke into a cold sweat. He'd long admired his master's boldness, murdering his own father, storming Marie Geoise alone, but this alliance was another matter. The Rockefeller pirates were the ocean's most ruthless killers. One misstep, and they'd all be dead. "Trust me," Doflamingo replied, leaning forward. His eyes gleamed with feverish ambition. "The Don Quixote family has only just risen in the North Sea. We need a backer, a force no less formidable than the Rockefeller pirates." He stared past the harbor lights toward the island looming on the horizon. Madness danced behind his gaze. "I've already lost my mind," he thought. "Why stop now?" Below, countless warships lay in cautious formation, never daring to close in. On the island's shore, every Rockefeller pirate sat in silent rows, methodically cleaning their weapons, ready for the signal that would unleash chaos on the seas. "Why haven't the Navy ships arrived yet?" Caesar yawned, blinking at the glassy sea. Estes drew a spotless white handkerchief and methodically wiped the blade of his sword. The metal's cold gleam caught the sunlight, and Caesar felt a shiver run down his spine. "Stay sharp," he muttered. Atop a weathered boulder, Charles sat cross-legged, the seven-star sword resting across his knees. His eyes were closed, his breathing slow and even. Behind him stood Barrett, Lowell, Roy, Turner, Andy, and Hodge, 6 silent sentinels ready for what was to come. Below them, the regiment of 500 swordsmen checked their weapons one last time. Every man knew today's fight would be the fiercest clash the Rockefeller pirates had ever faced. Blood would be spilled, lives lost, but none would go down unprepared. They would honor their own valor. Charles opened his eyes and scanned the horizon. "There," he said softly. Far off, dark shapes gradually materialized against the dawn sky. Warships, dozens of them, cut through the calm water, sails billowing as they bore inexorably toward the island. The battle was about to begin. Charles couldn't help but smile when he spotted someone familiar standing at the bow of the warship. "On my way," he called out in a deep, steady voice. Immediately, the crew straightened, weapons in hand, bracing themselves for the fight ahead. Chapter 292, Chaos. A sharp sea breeze danced across the deck of the warship, whipping the Navy's banner into a taut salute. Waves thundered against the hull, and every man aboard felt the tension tighten like a coiled spring. Over 2,000 sailors had been rushed in from scattered North Sea fleets, but numbers meant little when you stood face to face with the world's most feared pirate. "Gollum," someone muttered, voice tight with dread. A hush fell. Crewmen exchanged nervous glances, brows furrowed, throats tight. They had heard the pirate's legend, ruthless, unstoppable. Yet even as terror tickled their spines, a steely resolve glimmered in their eyes. Fear could only be conquered by steel and cannon fire. "Are we just going to stand here?" Admiral Zepha's voice cut through the murmur, booming from the bow. He trained his gaze on the lone figure waiting in the surf. Charles, slim and calm, water lapping at his knees. "Let's show him what the Royal Navy can do. Fire!" At that challenge, the fleet's admirals roared their assent. Cannons thundered in unison, muzzles flared and belched smoke. A hail of iron shot streaked skyward and hurtled toward the ocean, each shell splashing down like a meteor. The horizon churned beneath a pall of gunpowder haze. Then, through the haze of salt spray and smoke, a colossal shadow took shape, a dark silhouette rising against the sea, as though the ocean itself had birthed a mountain of menace. The shot didn't slow its approach. The warship lurched under each thunderous discharge, but the looming figure pressed on. Below deck and on the gunwales, sailors gripped their railings. Hearts pounded, but swords were drawn and cannons reloaded. The moment of reckoning had arrived, and aboard the flagship, every man braced for the storm of steel and blood that was about to break. The rush of cannon fire never let up. One shell after another screamed through the sky toward Charles, who sat serenely atop a jagged boulder. Even the hardened Rockefeller pirates, renowned for their fearlessness, found themselves uneasy under that relentless hail of iron and gunpowder. Charles didn't flinch. He leaned back on the rock, sword sheathed at his side, eyes half closed in what might have been boredom. As the next volley of shells arced closer, he quietly drew the seven-star sword. In an instant, the blade thrummed with energy, an emerald glow that bathed rock and sky alike. With a single fluid motion, he swept the sword overhead. A blade of pure green light shot upward, slicing the air with such speed it seemed to rend the heavens themselves. Each incoming shell disintegrated on contact, shattered by that brilliant slash before it could fall to earth. The entire battleground fell silent. "The world's #1 swordsman," someone breathed, voice quivering with awe. Glasses sliding down his nose, Doflamingo stared at the rippling shockwave left in the slash's wake. His pupils narrowed, tiny, incredulous dots of astonishment. "It's clear," he said at last, voice low. "We must rethink everything we thought we knew about the Rockefeller pirates." All around him, heads nodded in agreement. High above them, Charles sheathed his sword, the green glow fading, and simply watched as the cannon fire ground to a halt, his calm confidence more than enough to shatter their resolve. Charles watched impassively as thousands of enemy shells rose into the sky, only to be obliterated before they could fall. Not a single round reached the water. A brilliant flash hung for a heartbeat, then vanished. On the bow of the flagship, Commander Zephyr frowned. He'd expected resistance, but nothing of this magnitude. He waved a hand. "Lock on!" Without hesitation, the Navy's warships fell into formation and steamed toward the shore. Over 2,000 sailors and Marines poured out of their transports, weapons at the ready. Zephyr led the way, flanked by his senior officers, each face grim with determination. They closed the distance on Charles, who sat alone upon the sand, watching them come. A faint smile curved across Charles's lips. His eyes narrowed, pupils widening in the gathering gloom. An overwhelming force surged outward from him. A dark green aura rippled across the beach, bearing down on the approaching Navy. Instantly, the clear sky blackened. Ominous clouds massed overhead, and streaks of lightning forked through the air, illuminating the shoreline in eerie green flashes. The assembled soldiers froze, weapons lowering as Charles's power washed over them. The wind howled, carrying the promise of a single, undeniable truth. They faced an opponent beyond any they had ever known. Charles surveyed the assembled naval squadron with a half-smile, leaning back against the jagged boulder he'd claimed as his perch. Over 2,000 sailors stood before him, yet a single oppressive gaze swept across their ranks, and nearly 2/3 of them crumpled to their knees in agonized defeat. Colonels bowed their heads. Even several rear admirals bent low under the tyrannical weight of that stare. One stunned officer whispered, "Even a rear admiral." Captain Sikoski's jaw tightened as he glanced at Rear Admiral Zephyr, who stood motionless beside him. Zephyr's expression was unreadable, but Sikoski's own fury flared. "I can't let this continue," he growled. Dark energy coiled around Sikoski's fists as Zephyr slammed his boot into the deck with earth-shaking force. The shockwave ripped outward, tearing through the courtyard like an invisible gale. From hundreds of meters away, Charles still sat unmoved, his lazy grin never wavering. In an instant, he blurred, vanishing in a flash of light, only to reappear a hair's breadth beyond the falling wave. The boulder behind him exploded into fragments under the residual force. Sikoski rotated on his heel, driving a crushing punch toward Charles's new position. In the same heartbeat, a radiant sword of light sprang into existence, its blade colliding with the blow in a thunderous clang. The impact roared through the air, whipping dust and debris into a furious whirlwind. Sikoski's eyes blazed. "Eliminate him," he ordered. Revived by his command, the remaining officers raised their weapons and advanced in unison, ready to carry out his will. Kill every pirate. Leave no one standing. The moment Zephyr's cannons opened fire, the naval officers sprang into action. Steel rang on steel as they drew their weapons and charged. From Navy headquarters, the 3 lieutenant generals led the assault, blades and bayonets gleaming under the morning sun. Lieutenant General Darren grimaced, bared his teeth, and vaulted forward, but Sikoski was already 2 steps ahead. With a roar that rattled windows nearby, Sikoski thrust out his fist, magma burning along his gauntlet. "Behold the hellhound," he bellowed. A beast of molten rock lunged into being, its jaws snapping and steam hissing from every pore. Across the makeshift battlefield, Douglas Barrett's knuckles flared with dark energy. He met the magma hound head-on with a thunderous punch. "Douglas Barrett, heir of the devil," Sikorsky taunted, voice booming. Barrett sneered, eyes cold. "You want to see true power? Very well." He launched himself forward in a blur, striking Sikorsky's helmet with a crushing blow. Sparks flew as metal met magma. Sikorsky hammered back with all his strength, but the molten armor cracked under Barrett's relentless assault, sending fiery fragments skittering across the deck. Momentarily stunned, Sikorsky staggered. Barrett braced himself, ready to end the fight, and show the Navy exactly why he was feared above all others. The 3 lieutenant generals dispatched from Navy headquarters raised their hands in surrender, only to be intercepted by the 5 swordsmen of the Rockefeller pirates. At the same moment, Estes, Caesar, and the rest of their crew thundered into Colonel Rourke's unit, cutting down anyone who stood in their way. None of the colonels could match the combined might of Estes and Caesar, until a lone figure, known only as Ghost Spider, stepped forward and brought Estes to a halt. Clang! Esdeth's rapier flashed in the dim light as she met twin blades in midair. This Ghost Spider carried no mystical powers of resurrection, just a pair of razor-sharp knives in each hand. "A dual-blade swordsman," one of the pirates gasped. Estes scowled up at the newcomer, who barely reached his chest in height but radiated a deadly calm. "You little pirate," he snarled, "let's see how much of the world's greatest swordsman's legacy you really possess." Without another word, Ghost Spider launched into a flurry of cuts, each strike aimed at a vital point, each movement precise and merciless. "Bastard," he hissed as steel met steel. Realizing he was outmatched in close quarters, Estes activated his devil fruit ability. A creeping frost spread across the sanctuary's marble floor, freezing everything it touched, and he pressed his advantage against Ghost Spider's twin blades. "A devil fruit user," someone cried out, astonished by the sudden chill that enveloped the battlefield. And so, amid swirling ice and flashing steel, Ghost Spider and Estes hurled themselves into a duel that would decide the fate of everyone in the sanctuary. "Not a pure swordsman," the Ghost Spider murmured, its 8 spindly legs trembling with disappointment as it sized him up. It had assumed Charles's son would have picked up at least a few sword techniques from his legendary father, only to discover instead that the boy was a devil fruit user. "Bastard!" Charles shot back, bristling with indignation. "My father is my father, and I am my own man. Don't you dare compare us!" Chapter 293, Chaos. Charles seethed with fury at the insult. Why did everyone insist on comparing him to his father? Every time he faced a new opponent, the first thing they did was mention the Rockefeller name, and Charles was sick of it. His pupils snapped wide open as a pale, ice-blue energy flared around him. The air rippled with a tyrannical aura. Humph! Before the Ghost Spider could react, Charles's presence pressed down on him like a physical weight. The assassin's knife swing faltered as he struggled to breathe under the oppressive force. "Unbelievable," the Ghost Spider muttered, stepping back. "Such domineering power." He stared at the boy, no, the young man, who stood before him. Who else could exude an aura this absolute, this overwhelming? Then it hit him. "Of course, you must be the son of Charles Rockefeller." His eyes gleamed with cold intent. "You'll regret underestimating me." With a roar, the Ghost Spider unleashed his devil fruit ability, a twisted darkness that coiled toward Charles like living chains. But Charles didn't flinch. His ice-blue aura surged outward in a shockwave, shredding the encroaching shadows. The chains disintegrated midair, scattering into motes of black mist. Charles narrowed his eyes. The glow around him intensified, freezing the air and cracking the stone floor beneath his feet. The Ghost Spider staggered, his weapon clattering to the ground. "You won't get away with using my family name as a cheap shot," Charles said quietly, voice cold as winter steel. "Now you'd better decide. Do you want to live?" The Ghost Spider hesitated, chest heaving. In that instant, he glimpsed the unwavering conviction in Charles' gaze, and knew he'd made a grave mistake. The chilling power of the cold fruit spread instantly, driving the temperature around Esdeth so low that frost formed in midair. A biting wind sliced across the battlefield. "Die!" Esdeth hissed, summoning a blade of pure, icy light. Though its shape differed from the hero's famed slash, its lethality was unquestionable. Clang! The ghost spider met her blow with its twin broadswords, sparks flying as metal bit metal. Even through its heavy armor, the creature felt the blade's chill pierce its defenses. Impossible! This thing's not human, it snarled, reeling from the cold sting. Perched atop four jointed legs, the ghost spider launched itself back into the fray. Its swords danced in a lethal arc, each strike as precise as it was deadly. Esdeath met every blow, her own attacks swift and merciless. Blow followed blow in a blur, but Esdeath's control over ice granted her the advantage. With each parry, she gradually forced her foe onto the defensive. While those two titans clashed, Caesar, his body already aflame with azure scales, soared into the sky in the form of a majestic blue dragon. Unstoppable, he hurtled toward the rear admiral's flagship. Enormous and sinuous, he hovered above the decks, rain and snow whirling in his wake. From his gaping maw, he unleashed torrents of searing fireballs and razor-sharp wind blades. Every impact sent splintered wood and screaming sailors flying into the frigid air. After a time, even Caesar wearied of picking off nameless troops. He paused midair, wings outstretched, and surveyed the battlefield. There, at the heart of the carnage, Esdeath and the rear admiral stood locked in fierce combat, evenly matched. All around them, within dozens of meters, no living soul dared approach. The ground lay shattered and desolate, as if the earth itself recoiled from their deadly dance. Everyone instinctively gave them a wide berth. Charles shifted his gaze back to the rear admiral, a natural system devil fruit user who wielded molten magma, a power that actually rivaled his brother Barrett's. He raised an eyebrow in surprise. So the Navy did have some real heavyweights. His eyes then swept to the trio of lieutenant admirals from Navy headquarters and the governor of Beihai. One figure in particular caught his attention, Vice Admiral Darren, who was casually fishing off to the side. Igwed, Charles's irises gleamed, and in an instant he transformed into his colossal dragon form. Lieutenant Admiral Darren had developed a reputation since joining the headquarters ranks. Harassment was the polite term. Any newcomer foolish enough to approach him would soon find a lethal arc of sword energy slicing through the air. No one dared get close. "Hey there, Lieutenant Admiral," Charles boomed, his immense draconic silhouette streaking over Darren's head. In a blink, he touched down 10 meters in front of him, the ground quaking beneath his claws. "You look like you've got nothing better to do. Care to play?" Lieutenant General Darren spun on his heel, eyes widening as he took in the 3-meter-tall half-dragon standing before him. Caesar had shifted into his draconic form, his skin now cloaked in iridescent blue scales, a pair of menacing horns curving behind his skull, and a thick tail flicking in anticipation. At that towering height, he looked every bit the fearsome giant of legend. If he hefted a spiked club, he might have been mistaken for the legendary warlord Kaido himself. Darren, a battle-hardened veteran in his 60s, could feel his heart hammering in his chest. He'd fought countless foes in his life, but the raw power emanating from Caesar's transformed body was enough to make even him tremble. A slow, confident smile spread across Caesar's lips. He raised a massive hand, its 5 talon-tipped claws gleaming as they caught the sunlight. "Sky-rending claw," he declared. With a roar that rattled the air, Caesar lunged forward. His claws slashed down in a blinding arc, the very wind shrieking as it was torn apart. Lieutenant General Darren braced himself, shield raised, as the draconic strike descended toward him. The sky-tearing claw turned out to be nothing more than a theatrical prop, no hidden powers, just a scare tactic. Caesar squared off against Lieutenant General Darren of the Beihai governor's mansion with a casual grin. Tear! The sound of fabric ripping echoed through the courtyard. Bang! Darren was yanked off his feet by the claw and slammed into the ground, crying out in pain. 5 dark stains blossomed across his uniform where the claw had torn through to his chest. Darren gasped, clutching his wound. "Oh, the mighty Lieutenant General actually bleeds?" Caesar taunted, amusement dancing in his eyes. He shook his head in mild disbelief. He'd only equipped a simple claw. How had that sent a lieutenant general flying? He was supposed to be one of the Empire's elite officers. Caesar cast a quick glance at the nearby skirmish. 3 vice admirals locked in a fierce duel against 5 swordsmen. Despite the numerical disadvantage, they were holding their own. To one side, a magma-wreathed figure, surely only a major general by his insignia, and next to him, a colonel who refused to part from his sister's side. Returning his gaze to the fallen lieutenant general, Caesar folded his arms and smirked. "Tell me, Darren, how did you manage to get promoted? Even that colonel out there looks tougher than you." "Did you sneak in through the back entrance?" Lieutenant General Darren's voice dripped with sarcasm, though his face remained innocently polite. Charles merely raised an eyebrow. Before Darren could react, he gagged on a mouthful of blood and spat it out into the dust. "Cough! Cough! You little bastard!" Darren's face flushed crimson with rage. He glared at Charles, seething. He had been so sure he'd caught the boy off guard. How dare Charles mock him now? "I'll teach you a lesson you won't forget." Charles felt no urge to argue. He'd expected a battle. Instead, he found only this pompous general's bluster. With a sudden ripple of scales along his arms and the fierce hush of wings unfolding, his draconic heritage burst forth. In the blink of an eye, he vanished from Darren's sight. A moment later, a dark shape loomed above the general. Darren looked up in horror as a massive clawed hand seized his head. "No! Somebody help me!" he screamed, but the surrounding battlefield lay deserted. There would be no savior today. With bone-crushing force, Charles hoisted Darren aloft and slammed him face-first into the hard earth. A cloud of dust billowed up, punctuated by the sickening crack of bone. Again and again, Charles struck, relentless, until every ounce of resistance drained from Darren's body. Only when his foe lay utterly still did Charles release him. He stepped back, chest heaving, as the dust settled around the motionless lieutenant general. The battlefield fell silent. Charles stared down at the lieutenant general's bloody head. Miraculously, the skull wasn't cracked. Caesar let out a relieved sigh. "That was close," he murmured. Gently laying the still unconscious officer aside, Caesar turned his attention to the rest of the scene. His movement drew immediate notice. "Lieutenant General Darren!" Several Northern Sea naval officers called as they rushed forward. Governor Darren lay motionless beneath a heap of rubble. "Don't assume he's lost," one shouted. "We can still pull him through." Chapter 294, Chaos. Lieutenant General Darren, we'll avenge you. At the sight of their commander's lifeless body, the naval marines erupted in fury. One after another, they charged toward Caesar, heedless of the danger. Darren had spent his tenure as governor of Beihai cultivating loyalty, generous pay, steady rations, personal favors, earning the fierce devotion of his men, even as piracy flourished under his watch. Now, spurred by grief and rage, those same men sought to reclaim his honor in blood. Caesar watched them advance with cold amusement. "This might be fun," he murmured. In an instant, his form began to swell. Dark energy rippled outward as he transformed into a colossal dragon, scales glistening like obsidian. Dozens of meters long, the beast reared into the sky, wings unfurling in a deafening clap. The Marines skidded to a halt at the sight, hearts pounding. No blade, no cannon, no amount of courage could quell the terror inspired by ancient draconic power. They had come seeking vengeance, but against such a foe, their fury died on their lips. "Now," Caesar hissed, eyes blazing with eldritch fire, "let the real battle begin." A searing blast of fire erupted from the Kaiser Dragon's maw, engulfing the nearest rows of Marines in an instant. Their horrified cries of "no" and "mercy" were swallowed by the inferno. Within seconds, hundreds of men were reduced to ash. When the flames finally died away, all that remained were smoldering craters and a handful of crimson weapons. A lieutenant staggered back, eyes wide with terror. "You little demon, you're asking for death." From his vantage point on the naval flagship, Fleet Admiral Zephyr felt his blood run cold and his vision redden. How could he not be furious when hundreds of his men had been wiped out in a heartbeat? But on the Rockefeller Pirates' deck, Charles punched the air in triumph. A booming laugh escaped him. "Ha! Well done, Caesar!" At his signal, reinforcements surged forward without hesitation. Charles watched with satisfaction as waves of swordmasters, veterans he had recruited along the Grand Line, fanned out across the battlefield. Zephyr's face twisted with rage. "Damn you, Charles! You'll pay dearly for this." He realized far too late that his scouts had gravely underestimated the Rockefeller pirates. This first true clash between the Navy and Charles's crew had been a devastating intelligence failure, one that threatened to cost the Navy dearly in the days ahead. Zepha's chest tightened as he surveyed the battlefield. He had seriously underestimated the Rockefeller pirates. Take Douglas Barrett, for example. His bounty barely topped 3 million, yet his actual strength clearly exceeded that value. And those 5 swordsmen? Who would have guessed their combined bounties didn't even reach 1 million? He'd misjudged them all. But what truly unnerved him were the 2 children standing nearby. 10 years old, if that, and already wielding power on par with seasoned fighters. At this rate, they might grow into the next generation of Rockefellers, especially the boy named Charles. "Charles," Zepha roared, lunging forward with blistering speed. His fist, wreathed in the darkest hue of armament Haki, smashed toward Charles with a force the boy had never before faced. Charles met the blow without hesitation. He drew his sword in one swift motion and unleashed his secret technique. Demon Sword, Overlord! A raven-black aura spiraled up the blade, colliding with Zepha's armored fist in a cataclysmic burst. The impact tore the sky open with a thunderous crack, and the earth beneath them splintered into jagged fissures. Dust and debris roared outward as the 2 combatants hovered at the center of an explosion of power. Neither gave an inch, each refusing to back down. But in that moment, Charles knew one thing for certain. He had just met his match. Shards of earth exploded into the air as the 2 combatants finally unleashed their full strength. Charles swung a crushing punch just as his opponent's blade met it with a thunderous clash. Once both sides went all out, the battle spiraled beyond anyone's control. Debris rained down so relentlessly that even the hardiest soldiers staggered, unable to keep their footing as the island trembled beneath their feet. Doflamingo watched from a distance, lips pressed into a thin line. 4 days and 3 nights. That was how long this duel had raged without a single victor. Meanwhile, both navies lay in ruin. Over 2,000 sailors had fallen, and fewer than 100 survivors had been mustered by Rear Admiral Sokolsky. 3 vice admirals dispatched from Navy headquarters, each one among the fleet's finest, had been cut down by the little ghost who could transform into a dragon and wield 5 swords at once. Only Sokolsky's timely magma bomb had prevented disaster at the other flank. The naval colonel facing Charles's daughter would surely have perished if not for that last-second intervention. Doflamingo's brow tightened. If this was the true might of the world's top-tier fighters, then any hope of a swift victory had vanished into the dust and thunder of their endless clash. Sokolsky didn't wait to be pushed back. She broke off from her skirmish, vaulted onto the back of the ghost spider mech, and sped toward the warship. Above them, Uebu hovered effortlessly, its boots kicking up no dust, yet advancing inexorably. For a long moment, no one dared challenge its approach, until Caesar stepped forward, ready to intervene. But when he caught sight of the merciless glint in Uebu's eyes, he hesitated. He knew that a solo attack against such a foe would end in disaster. With a curt nod, Sokolsky abandoned the scattered enemy forces, and Caesar reluctantly fell back. Both sides silently agreed to hold their ground and turned their attention to the true center of power on the island, Admiral Rockefeller Charles and his rival. The 2 titans clashed with earth-shattering force. Every strike sent shockwaves ripping through the ground, fissures racing outward as if the island itself trembled in fear. Green arcs of lightning lanced through the air. Surging waves of raw energy battered the cliffs. And then, just as the island seemed it might hold, Charles unleashed a colossal blast of emerald power that crackled and roared. The strain was too much. With a groan of tearing stone, the island split wide open. Chunks of earth and rock toppled into the sea as water surged in, swallowing everything in its path. Under the combined onslaught of Charles and Zepha, the very ground beneath their feet gave way, and the island began to sink. In the heart of the disaster, Charles and Zepha stood locked in a defiant standoff. Around them, seawater rushed ankle-deep, debris floated on the rising tide, and the air crackled with lingering energy. Neither combatant wavered, their auras still pulsing with power, as they readied themselves for the decisive moment that would determine the fate of everything around them. Charles and Zepha stood chest to chest, their once pristine garments now shredded to rags, exposing muscled torsos. Jagged scars crisscrossed Zepha's skin, trophies from countless battles, but Charles's alabaster flesh was untouched, save for the film of dust clinging to him. For 4 days and 3 nights they had fought without end, and yet neither had gained the upper hand. To any onlooker, it must have looked like a staged duel. Between them, swirling wisps of white energy hissed and frothed. Their shared ability, known as returning life, flooded back into them, replenishing every bruise and broken bone. As they tuned into the shifting ground beneath their feet, both warriors paused at once and exchanged hard stares. Then, without warning, Charles threw back his head and laughed. His voice rang out clear and wild across the island. "Ha, Zephyr, if you ever hope to catch me, you'll need Garp and Sengoku working together." He folded his arms, still grinning. Though the fight had stretched on nearly a week, Charles felt certain he could best Zephyr by the 7th day. Killing him, however, that would be another matter entirely. The two were perfectly even. Defeating Zephyr was hard enough, and killing her was all but impossible. If Zephyr chose to withdraw, Charles wouldn't have been able to stop her. Chapter 295, Zephyr's Retreat. The ground shook violently, fissures tearing across the island as it began to sink beneath the crashing waves. In the eye of the storm stood Zephyr and Charles, facing each other across the trembling earth. Charles's eyes flashed green with determination, his lips quirking into a confident smirk. "Zephyr, that punch of yours was embarrassingly weak." A dark, oppressive aura surged around Zephyr, crackling like a brewing storm. Yet beneath the display of power, there was a flicker of unease in his gaze. "You'll eat those words once I'm done with you," he growled. "Pirate scum," Charles replied coolly, drawing his sword in a single fluid motion. "Remember this. Good always triumphs over evil." Zephyr lunged, his fists blurring with vicious intent, but his movements, though fierce, betrayed a lack of focus. Seizing the opening, Charles darted in like lightning, blade poised. Zephyr barely had time to raise his arms in defense. Steel met iron with a deafening clang, and the sheer force of the blow sent him flying backward. He skid across jagged rocks, skidding hundreds of meters before finally coming to rest. Struggling to his feet, Zephyr felt a burning pressure in his chest, as if invisible hands were crushing his lungs. He clutched his side and coughed, blood flecking his lips. Despite the pain, his eyes blazed with stubborn defiance. "This isn't over," he rasped, even as the island groaned and began to slip beneath the waves. Zephyr's face turned crimson as he stared at Charles. The very island beneath Charles's feet trembled violently, long cracks spidering through the earth. Alarmed, Zephyr stumbled back, his eyes never leaving Charles's silent figure. Clutching his chest, he spun and bolted for the nearest Navy launch. Above them, Charles gathered his chi and unleashed the moonstep, his body shimmering in midair. "Professor Zephyr," Lieutenant Sokolsky shouted, racing to his side. "Pull back. This mission has failed. Withdraw immediately." Zephyr opened his mouth to answer, but a sudden, brutal fit of coughing cut him off. Blood spurted from his lips as he half collapsed to one knee on the deck. Head bowed, he let the pain wash over him. After 8 years of relentless training, he had been defeated again, defeated utterly. Around them, wrecked warships listing in the water bore grim testimony to the disaster. All the vessels sent from naval headquarters, even the reinforcements from the Beihai branch, had been wrecked. Only 5 or 6 battered patrol boats remained afloat. In that moment, Zephyr knew with a sinking heart that the entire operation had collapsed into failure. Not only had they failed to capture Rockefeller Charles, but they'd also suffered devastating losses. "Retreat. Notify headquarters immediately. I will accept full responsibility for the failure of this mission," the fleet commander roared, frustration and shame warring in his voice. "My lord," a breathless staff officer interjected, bowing low. "General Sakasaki is the only senior officer left from the engagement. He begs permission to remain under your command." The commander's glare cut through the tension, but after a long moment he gave a curt nod. "Very well." Sakasaki's reply came in a rough whisper. He felt like a hollow shell. It was his first time involved in a battle of this scale, and he'd never anticipated the vaunted North Sea Navy being routed by a ragtag band of pirates. 3 lieutenant generals from headquarters lay dead, their loss shattering the Navy's command structure, and thousands of sailors, elite troops drawn from every North Sea division, had perished alongside them. Although 2,000 men had been dispatched to confront the pirates, their impact was negligible. Pirate ships had relentlessly pounded the Navy's vessels, smashing hulls until they could scarcely stay afloat and incapacitating crews with electrified currents. If Sakasaki hadn't personally risked his life to tow the crippled warships out of the kill zone, not a single boat would have returned. Damn! Admiral Sakaski slammed his fist against the rail, eyes burning as he stared at the turbulent sea and then at the pirate ships disappearing over the horizon. I will catch you yet! Charles watched Zifa's vessel slip away without a backward glance. He didn't give chase. Instead, he turned his gaze to the burning sunset, weighing the victory in his mind. They had won the day. He hadn't slain their foes, but he had driven them to withdraw. That alone was worth the price. Aboard the Poseidon, the surviving crew stood in ragged rows on deck, uniforms tattered and faces streaked with sweat and blood. The Swordsman regiment, once 1,000 strong, now counted barely 300, and many of those were too badly wounded to fight again. Still, Charles let himself feel pride. Today, the Rockefeller pirates had stamped their name on every port and trading post across the seas. Thanks to Morgan's footage, everyone would know the story. A pirate crew that had bested an admiral's naval fleet. Except for the legendary Rocks pirates, no other band of sea rogues could claim such a feat. In the past, the Royal Navy had always hunted down pirates, so much so that the very idea of pirates driving the Navy back seemed impossible. Yet here they were. Charles stepped onto the deck and the crew erupted in cheers. Long live the captain! Long live the Rockefeller pirates! Their ragged yells echoed over the waves. Every man and woman standing before him was smeared with sweat and blood, their once straight swords now bent from relentless battle. Charles allowed himself a small, proud smile. Zephyr still lived, but the Admiral's fleet had been all but wiped out by Charles's crew. He had never imagined his ragtag team could rout 4 vice-admirals in a single engagement. Where once he had shielded them all, it was now their victory to claim, and he could feel just how far they had come. He raised his hand, calling for silence. "All right, set our course away from these waters," he shouted. "After today's defeat, the Navy won't have the strength to hunt us down again. From now on, the whole world will have to make way for the Rockefeller pirates." Around him, his crew's eyes gleamed with fierce loyalty. News of this stunning triumph would dominate every portside and dock newspaper from the very next sunrise, announcing to the world that the age of the Rockefeller pirates had only just begun. Charles could already foresee the storm that would follow once word of Admiral Zefa's humiliating defeat and serious injury swept the seas. The Navy and the world government would be thrown into disarray, scrambling to plug the cracks in their defenses. In the chaos, pirates everywhere would break loose, launching savage raids on merchant fleets and isolated strongholds. With their attention consumed by the fallout, the authorities wouldn't have the manpower to hunt down the Rockefeller pirates. Provided, of course, that Charles's crew avoided any outright assaults on world government member nations. As long as they refrained from actions that threatened the very foundation of global order, they would remain largely invisible. That window of freedom was exactly when Charles planned to embark on his grand voyage around the world. Meanwhile, at Navy headquarters, panic was already bubbling over. "Moses! Moses!" Admiral Cyborg Sora barked into his headset. "Report, what do you mean Admiral Zephyr has failed? He's injured. Dispatch a carrier immediately and bring him home." He slammed down the receiver and cast a cold gaze across the bustling command deck. Despite the uproar unfolding around him, Sora felt only a weary resignation. The pirates of the New World were growing more cunning by the day, and among them, none were more elusive or unpredictable than the Rockefeller pirates, led by the young yet formidable Charles Rockefeller. Charles has turned up in every engagement, and each time he walks away with barely a scratch. Meanwhile, the Royal Navy bleeds ships and sailors at his hand. True, the last operation ended in failure, but it was more of a setback than a disaster. What really matters is spinning this defeat to the Navy's advantage. With that plan in mind, Sora stormed into the war room and picked up the comms handset. He dialed Marie Gioia without hesitation, launching into a dramatic recital of their losses, each more harrowing than the last, as he begged for additional support and resources. Chapter 296. When the battle between the Navy and the Rockefeller pirates finally ended, Morgus wasted no time dispatching a report declaring the pirates' decisive triumph. Any official communique celebrating a naval victory was immediately shredded. As the news swept across every port and capital, the world trembled. Morning editions blared the headlines. Rockefeller pirates shatter North Sea fleet. Admiral Black Arm, Zephyr defeated. Everyone read it in stunned silence. For weeks, the clash had been brewing. Navy headquarters had sent Admiral Zephyr, legendary Black Arm of the fleet, to the North Sea to take on Charles Rockefeller, the notorious pirate lord of the New World. For an entire month, courts and taverns buzzed with speculation. Who would prove superior, the Navy's invincible hero or the rising pirate captain? The answer shocked the world. The invincible admiral fell at the hands of a pirate. Outrage flared at the Navy's failure, and dread spread at the knowledge that pirates now wielded such unstoppable power. North Sea, off the island where the decisive engagement had taken place, the water lay eerily calm in the aftermath of cannon smoke and splintered timber. Sailors leaned over bulwarks, scanning the horizon for survivors or reinforcements. Somewhere inland, the wounded were being tended. Above them, seabirds wheeled in the gray sky. "Dover!" someone cried, voice cutting through the hush. A gaunt figure scrambled up the cliff path, wiping sweat and blood from his brow. His uniform was tattered, his sword chipped, but his eyes blazed with the same fierce loyalty he'd shown throughout the battle. "Yes, sir," Dover called down, steadying himself against a stone outcropping. A scarred veteran of countless skirmishes, Dover had stood by Charles through every twist of this bloody campaign. Now, battered by cannon fire and close-quarters carnage, he still answered without hesitation. "Report," the voice demanded from the summit. It was Charles himself, tall, resolute, his coat torn but his bearing unshaken. A dozen of his pirate lieutenants flanked him, every man an instrument of rebellion against the world's naval powers. "We've secured the island, Captain," Dover panted, catching his breath. "Casualties are heavy, but the Navy's survivors are in chains. Our flag flies over their wrecks." Charles studied the fallen sails and ruined masts below. In his gaze was both triumph and calculation, knowing the sea's currents could shift as swiftly as an admiral's orders. "Very good," he said quietly. "Send word to Morgus. Let the world know who rules these waters now." Dover saluted, turned, and raced back down the slope to transmit the victory that would shake every fleet on the high seas. Charles Rockefeller, once merely a name whispered in fear, had just rewritten the rules of naval warfare, and the world would never be the same. "Shall we press on, sir?" Torobol asked, squinting at the immense black warship cutting through the waves. Doflamingo, still a young man, but brimming with raw confidence, shook his head. "Not yet," he said coolly. "In our present guises, we can't stand against those titans. First, I'll seize control of Beihai's underworld, then I'll be ready to move alongside him." He watched the Rockefeller pirates' flagship, the Poseidon, drift away from their small vessel. As the great ship faded into the sunset, Doflamingo's eyes gleamed with ambition. Charles looked around, but the future tyrant had already vanished, his silhouette swallowed by the horizon. With the battle's conclusion came the Navy's new bounty list, delivered as promised. In this shifting balance of power, even Charles's adopted son, Caesar, had drawn the Marines' wrath. Caesar Rockefeller, eldest son of Charles Rockefeller, now carried an astronomical 6,000 berry bounty. Rumored to possess a mythical zone devil fruit that let him transform into a fearsome beast, a ghostly phantom, or a colossal green dragon, he was also accused of assassinating the North Sea's governor. So heinous was the crime that the Navy wed to apprehend him at any cost. Charles scanned the latest bounty bulletin with growing interest. At the very top stood Rockefeller Estes, known throughout the Grand Line as the eldest daughter of the Rockefeller family, now carrying a staggering 2,000 million Bailey price on her head. Right beneath her was Leng Guo, nicknamed Superman, whose participation in the Battle of Beihai and the slaughter of several naval officers had earned him a death-only warrant. But what caught Charles's eye next was Douglas Barrett, deputy captain of the Rockefeller Pirates and wielder of the rare superhuman fusion fruit. Barrett's bounty had surged to 8,000 million Baileys, and like the others, his tag read, "Dead or Alive." Charles blinked. 8 billion was an enormous sum, especially for someone who had only recently risen through the ranks. After all, the notorious Qingjiao had been carving a legend in the New World for over 5 years, yet her bounty had only just reached that level. Barrett, by contrast, had been active for hardly 2.5 years since his devil fruit awakened, and already he stood shoulder to shoulder with the fiercest names in piracy. Glancing further down the list, Charles noted with a wry smile that the famed 5 swordsmen, who had famously slain 3 veteran Marine lieutenant generals, had also earned their places among the most wanted. It seemed the world's most dangerous outlaws were only growing more audacious. In the aftermath of their latest showdown, reward notices blazed across the seas, each one a testament to the Rockefeller pirates' new sword mastery under Charles. Elvis Lowell, rescued from a coolie camp by Estes, this greatsword prodigy advanced into the swordmaster realm under Charles's tutelage. His dazzling performance earned him a bounty of 3 billion Baileys. Dick Roy, dubbed the Quickblade for his lightning-fast strikes, Roy's speed and precision netted him 2 billion Baileys. Brian Turner, wielding twin swords with uncanny skill, Turner claimed a staggering 9 billion Baileys. Andy Nelson, the elusive dagger specialist, received an unlisted bounty, his price kept secret to match the deadly reputation of his blade. Boris Hodge, a master of the rapier, Hodge's refined technique secured him 8 billion Baileys. These towering bounties revealed just how rare true swordsmen had been among the Rockefeller pirates until now. With Charles firmly established as the world's greatest swordsman, the crew's prestige soared overnight. Aspiring blade masters, long hesitant to venture out to sea, finally made their decision. They would sail under Charles's banner and carve out their own legends. The Navy, unprepared for this sudden surge of talent, could only watch in astonishment as the Rockefeller fleet grew stronger by the day. Even Charles's bounty had at last inched upward. As captain of the Rockefeller pirates and the world's greatest swordsman, known far and wide as the Blood Swordsman, he now carried a 35 billion berry price tag, wanted dead or alive for atrocities too gruesome to list. It was an eye-catching sum, but it still left him trailing behind the true giants of the sea, Monkey D. Roger, Golden Lion Shiki, and Edward Newgate, Whitebeard. Of those 3, Roger's bounty sat highest of all, and every few days it seemed to climb again, as though the naval headquarters were bent on fueling his legend. Charles couldn't imagine what secret leverage they'd uncovered. Perhaps another poneglyph had surfaced, stirring the world government into action. Poneglyphs, the indestructible stone tablets of a vanished civilization, were as mysterious to Charles now as when he first arrived. His attempt at time travel had failed, stranding him in this chaotic era with nothing but rumors and half-heard legends to guide him. Adjusting to the ruthless, ever-shifting currents of the pirate world had proven far tougher than he'd ever expected. Yet despite the staggering bounties and towering reputations, Charles steeled himself for whatever came next, determined to carve out his own place among the sea's Edist. Chapter 15, A Year of Quiet Seas. The year was 1492 by the lunar calendar, more than 12 months since Charles's decisive victory over Zephyr. In all that time, the Rockefeller pirates had continued their usual rounds, drifting into port every now and then to restock and recruit. Yet despite their notorious reputation, those appearances sparked little alarm. The Navy, for its part, seemed content to leave them be. No admirals hunted them down, and the world government showed no sign of interference. It was as if an unspoken pact had settled over the seas. As long as Charles caused no trouble, neither Navy nor Crown would trouble him. Charles understood this uneasy peace better than anyone. Since the fall of Zephyr, he had based himself in Beihai, the northern ocean he now called home. Over the months, he shaped his operations into something surprisingly stable. Whenever he set sail for one of the bustling island ports, he took his young crew, his adopted children, as everyone affectionately called them, along for the journey. At first, the islanders greeted the approach of the Rockefeller flag with panic. Rumors of pillage and plunder had always clung to their name, but time and again, they discovered that Charles's men came only to trade, to repair, and occasionally to entertain, never to raid. Slowly, word spread across the archipelago. Leave the Rockefeller pirates alone, and they'll leave you in peace. Whether that message came directly from Charles or from some well-informed merchant, no one could say. What mattered was its effect. No kingdom dared launch an assault on the Rockefeller fleet. Governors whispered of greater threats elsewhere, while common folk welcomed the pirates' occasional shows, colorful fireworks, exotic spices, and thrilling sea tales. In a world rife with conflict, the North Seas had become an islander's respite, guarded by the very outlaws they once feared. And so, for over a year, Charles and his family of pirates sailed undisturbed. The memory of Zepha's defeat grew faint on every wave they crossed, replaced instead by the newfound harmony of a sea that, at least for now, danced to their own, unchallenged tune. On the contrary, when word spread of the Rockefeller pirates' prowess, many of the bolder kingdoms were only too happy to roll out the red carpet, inviting every member of the crew to a lavish banquet at the palace. Charles would never turn down a free feast. Besides, he'd forged a quiet understanding with the Navy. He wouldn't cause trouble, and they'd look the other way. Trouble, after all, was the pirates' only real source of income, and feeding such a large crew was an enormous expense. Without successful raids, they had no provisions to speak of. Unfortunately for them, luck had run dry. Chapter 297. After Charles's daring exploits, rumors of the Rockefeller pirates spread like wildfire across the North Sea. No one dared oppose them anymore. Having made several voyages to the island, Charles found the port overrun with ambitious swordsmen, each eager for the honor of dueling the world's #1 blade. Until now, challengers had to journey all the way to the New World to face the reigning champion, an arduous trek many preferred to avoid. But with that champion now ashore in Beihai, every would-be duelist saw their chance at glory. Charles entrusted these mass challenges to his lieutenants, intervening personally only when an opponent truly reached the rank of swordsman. Even then, his victories were swift, never more than 3 or 4 moves. After all, true swordsmen were still a rare breed, and none could match his experience. In the intervening days, a small number of outstanding and earnest swordsmen sought Charles's mentorship. He offered them little more than a few pointed remarks and corrections, yet they accepted every word as gospel, bowing deeply in reverence whenever he spoke. In their eyes, he was not just the world's finest swordsman, but a master worth following to the ends of the seas. Charles had one clear goal: to demonstrate his steadfast loyalty to the great Rockefeller family. To downplay the pirate label and lend his crew an air of legitimacy, he made a bold move. He personally lowered the black flag and raised the Rockefeller family banner in its place. Everyone understood the ruse, of course, but the distinction between the Rockefeller pirates and the Rockefeller household remained clear. This cunning strategy not only burnished his own reputation, but also gave the Navy and the world government a dignified face to present. It was a perfect alliance. The pirate world thrived on adventure rather than mindless bloodshed, and the kingdoms could discreetly court Charles's fleet without openly admitting they'd invited outlaws into their ports. From early 1491 to the end of October 1492 on the Haiyuan calendar, nearly 2 full years, Charles guided the Rockefeller pirates through every inlet and harbor of the North Sea. He secured unprecedented renown throughout Beihai, completing a full survey of its coasts and islands. Now, with Beihai firmly under their belt, Charles set his sights on the next horizon, the West Sea. Charles watched from the docks as Vinsmoke Gage prepared to sail out of the North Sea. 8 years ago, he had abducted the brilliant scientist from Punk Hazard and pressed him into service. In time, Charles released Gage, but only after promising to build him a ship worthy of his talents. Now that his own departure from Beihai was fast approaching, Charles felt the weight of that promise more keenly than ever. He strode up beside Gage, who stood motionless, staring out at the rolling waves. "Gage," Charles began, his voice firm but betraying a hint of unease, "you've served me faithfully all these years. You know what I asked of you in return. We're about to set sail from Beihai, and it's high time I kept my word." For a heartbeat, Gage did not move, his expression unreadable. Then he turned those cold, calculating eyes toward Charles, silently inviting him to continue. Charles hesitated, his earlier resolve faltering at the sight of the man who had been both his greatest asset and, in some ways, his one true friend. He swallowed hard. "I'm sorry it took me so long," he admitted, "but I won't let you down again. Let's get to work." At those words, Gage's face softened just enough to show that Charles's apology and his promise had reached him. Together, they walked back toward the shipyard, where the timbers of a new vessel waited, ready to carry them both into the unknown. Charles stood on the docks, his gaze fixed on the sleek new hull resting in the morning light. He drew a slow breath, bracing himself. Beside him, Gage's posture was rigid, 8 years of labor etched in every line of his frame. "From the very beginning," Charles began, his voice low and steady, "I promised you one thing. The moment this ship was finished, I'd set you free. I never imagined it would take so long. I hope you don't hate me for making you wait." Gage's shoulders sagged, a ragged breath escaped him, and for an instant he simply stared at Charles in disbelief. Then tears sprang to his eyes. All those years, countless late nights bent over sails and timbers, enduring every back-breaking chore, had been for Charles's dream. If not for his own devotion to reviving the Vinsmoke name, he would have walked away long ago. Charles reached out and laid a hand on Gage's shoulder. "Hey," he said softly, "don't be upset. You've more than earned your freedom. From now on, you're no longer bound by any promise or debt, and if ever you need help, truly need it, you'll find me waiting. That's my oath to you." Gage's composure shattered. He let out a choked sob and leaned into Charles's steadying hand. Charles felt a tight ache in his chest at the sight of the man he'd come to rely on most breaking down. He'd meant to unburden Gage, but seeing him like this, so raw and grateful, made Charles wonder if he'd done the right thing. Still, he kept his hand firm on Gage's shoulder, offering what comfort he could. The ship stood ready behind them, a monument to their shared toil and to the promise that, at long last, was finally fulfilled. "All aboard. Hurry up, don't look back." Charles stood on the deck of the Vinsmoke, waving at the little rowboat bobbing alongside. In it, Gage stared at the provisions he'd packed for her, sacks of dried meat, hardtack, and a flask of water. Tears sprang to her eyes. "That scoundrel," she muttered, dabbing at her cheeks. "After 8 years in his service, he finally lets me go. What gall!" Silent tears running down her face, Gage climbed into the boat. "Goodbye," she whispered. Charles lingered at the bow, watching her shove off. To his surprise, Caesar Courant, who hadn't stepped outside his laboratory in ages, appeared on deck to bid his scientific partner farewell. The two friends watched in silence as Gage rowed steadily away, her back to them, until her little lantern was nothing more than a speck on the dark horizon. "How strange," Charles sighed, brushing a hand over his forehead. Then he gave Caesar's shoulder a reassuring squeeze. "I don't think she really wants to leave." Caesar nodded, concern etched on his face. "You're right. All her hard work, her research, her experiments, she must regret abandoning it." Arm in arm, they strolled back toward the cabin. Halfway down the corridor, Charles stopped and slapped his palm against his thigh. Her lab notes, she left them on board. With renewed purpose, the two dashed off in search of Gage's priceless data. Charles hovered next to Caesar Courant, surveying the line of fallen subjects strewn across the lab floor. "Most of them are useless," Caesar observed, shading his eyes. "But these so-called biological soldiers, now those have real research value." Charles cocked his head. "Biological soldiers? You mean fighters modified so they don't feel pain?" Caesar shook his head with a slight grin. "Pain suppression is only part of it. These soldiers are fused with weapon systems, bladed limbs, projectile launchers, chemical dispersers. If our experiments succeed, we'll have living weapons at our disposal." Charles's eyes sparkled. "Then we must pursue the research. Imagine the Rockefeller pirates fielding an army of unflagging biosoldiers, unfailingly loyal, never demanding pay. Our strength would skyrocket." He paused, briefly considering whether he should abandon this path and chase down Vinsmoke instead. But no, this project was too promising to set aside. Caesar straightened his lab coat, confidence radiating from him. Of course it's possible. Who better than Caesar Courant to outshine Dr. Vegapunk? Biosoldiers? Mere child's play. Give me a few weeks, and I'll deliver a new era of warfare. By the way, Charles asked suddenly, what's the status of those artificial devil fruits you've been creating? I've been supplying you, Grog. It's at least 10 every year, and I'd hate to see them go unused. Imagine if we distributed them among my men. we could assemble an entire army of animal fighters. Chapter 298. Ever since Caesar Clown set out to create artificial devil fruits, Charles had been quietly funding his research. Charles believed in Caesar's genius. If anyone could pull it off, it would be him. Yet after 3 or 4 years and nearly 50 devil fruits consumed, there was still no breakthrough. Some of those fruits had been eaten by animals, others by people whose transformations Charles arranged so Caesar could study them, but none provided the key to synthetic production. When Charles finally asked for an update, Caesar broke out in a cold sweat. He knew his captain cared only about results, never the messy details. Over the years, Charles had supplied him with at least 10 fresh devil fruits every year, handing them over the moment he acquired them, often plucked from unsuspecting beasts or hidden smugglers. Ordinary people didn't even recognize these fruits when Charles offered them up, but to Caesar they were invaluable specimens. I do have a few clues, Caesar stammered, wiping his brow. But it'll take more time to verify them. I promise, we're close to success. He shot Charles a pleading look, hoping his captain's patience would hold out a while longer. Okay. Charles didn't argue. He wasn't in any hurry, nor did he mind if those run-of-the-mill zone devil fruits went to waste. He had plenty of far more powerful fruits in reserve, and frankly, he had no use for the ordinary ones. Still, aware that each of those common devil fruits carried a minimum bid of million belly, he felt compelled to press the issue. Now hurry up, he said, patting Caesar Courant on the shoulder. Don't disappoint me. I'm not asking you to turn into another Vegapunk, but if even Vegapunk can produce artificial devil fruits, I know you can too. The challenge had its effect. For days, Caesar had barely emerged from his laboratory, yet he never failed to deliver everything Charles requested. In fact, Charles's scientific corps alone accounted for nearly half of the Rockefeller Pirates' expenses, sometimes even more. After 17 years of traveling the Grand Line, Charles still believed wholeheartedly that technology remained the greatest productive force. Charles paused at the closed laboratory door, deciding not to disturb Dr. Morgan. He stepped back out onto the deck and watched the third batch of children at play. The eldest was 6, the youngest 5, prime age for their next trial. It was time to administer the devil fruits. Retracing his steps to his quarters, Charles unlocked a hidden cabinet and pulled out 21 neatly arranged devil fruits. He spread them out on the table and took inventory. Nature-type fruits, 14, swamp fruit, sickle fruit, mirror fruit, door fruit, temperature fruit, heat fruit, obsidian fruit, stone fruit, glass fruit, momo fruit, cube fruit, paper fruit, thorn fruit, pressure fruit. Zoology-type fruits, 6, phantom beast, vampire form, ancient species, imperator crocodile form, ancient species, titan python form, ancient species, saber-toothed tiger form, ancient species, dimorphodon form, ancient species, archaeopteryx form. Unclassified fruit, 1, a mysterious, unrecorded devil fruit. In total, there were 21 fruits, though Charles had already set aside the vampire fruit for a later experiment. That left 20 devil fruits ready for today's feeding. He closed his eyes, took a steadying breath, and prepared to begin. Charles stood in the same lofty chamber on the upper decks where he'd last distributed devil fruits. Before him lay 20 of the strange glowing fruits, just as he'd arranged them the previous time. He glanced at the maid standing respectfully nearby. "Myrtle," he called, "please fetch Julie, Logan, Philip, Trunks, Kakarot, and Gebetta." Myrtle bowed and hurried off. A few moments later, the 6 children burst in, trailing Robert and a couple of deckhands. As they rounded on Charles, a dozen small voices rang out in unison. "Father!" Their excited chatter threatened to totter the hall's calm. Charles raised a hand. "Quiet, please. No more shouting." He sighed, rubbing his temples. "Before we decide who takes home a devil fruit today, I have one question. Have any of you finished your homework?" Silence fell like a curtain. Julie, the lone girl among them, tucked a strand of hair behind her ear and blinked down at the floor. Logan shifted from foot to foot. Philip and Trunks exchanged guilty glances. Only Kakarot and Gebetta dared not look at him at all. Charles couldn't stifle a wry smile. He remembered himself at their age, just as restless, just as eager to play. "Well then," he said, tone softening, "let's get this over with. Who's ready for a devil fruit?" At the promise of their reward, the children straightened immediately, faces lighting up with fresh anticipation. Charles nodded, satisfied. The real fun was only just beginning. You need to study hard. Playing all day won't get you anywhere. Charles sighed as he gazed down at the 6 little ones, their minds clearly wandering off somewhere. He shook his head, then cut to the chase. Julie, Logan, Philip, Trunks, Kakarot, Gebeta, oldest of you is 6, youngest is 5. I called you here today because of your potential. Look at these devil fruits. He held up a display of 20 brilliantly colored fruits, each pulsing with strange energy. Eat one, and you'll gain the same powers your older brothers and sisters enjoy. At the mention of siblings' abilities, the children's eyes lit up. They leaned forward, mouths agape, dazzled by the swirling hues of the fruits. Charles allowed himself a small, pleased smile. All right, let's go in order of age. Logan, step forward. Logan advanced with solemn determination. He studied the fruits laid out before him, arranged neatly by type, natural, elemental, animal, and so on. A single fruit sat alone atop the natural row. Logan paused, then glanced at the murky, swamp-gray fruit nearby. He frowned and shook his head, clearly unimpressed. He folded his arms and waited for Charles's next instruction, ready to claim the power he deemed worthy. Charles watched as Logan pored over the stacked devil fruits, eyes sparkling at the myriad powers each one promised. At last, Logan's gaze settled on the animal category. With a decisive nod, he reached out and plucked a large, mottled orange fruit carved in the likeness of a saber-toothed tiger, an ancient species devil fruit, lifting it triumphantly. "Dad, I've chosen," Logan announced, brandishing the fruit. Charles arched an eyebrow. He hadn't expected his son to pick an animal-type ability, but he kept his thoughts to himself. "All right," he said. "Make sure you really want it. Then eat." Logan didn't hesitate. He sank his teeth into the fruit, and an instant later, his face twisted in disgust. The foul, acrid taste surged through his mouth, and he fought the urge to spit it out. "Logan, hang in there and finish it," Caesar called out urgently, stepping forward. Swallowing hard against the nausea, Logan gritted his teeth and devoured the entire cantaloupe-sized fruit in a few determined bites. All the while, the little ghosts gathered around, silent, shocked spectators to the boy's ordeal. Chapter 299. Charles watched Logan's transformation with a quiet smile. In an instant, Logan's fingers tipped into razor-sharp claws, his muscles swelling until his clothes tore under the strain. A low feral growl filled the hall as he rose to over 2 meters in height, fur sprouting along his limbs, and that unmistakable, saber-toothed maw appearing where his human face had been moments before. Staggering, Logan stared at his paws on the marble floor, eyes wide with shock. The surge of power was beyond anything he'd ever experienced. His battle-ready expression melted into panic. Calmly, Charles produced a pair of handcuffs from his coat, high-loose stone restraints, custom-forged to suppress devil fruit transformations. He snapped them around Logan's wrists. Instantly, a heavy magic laced through Logan's body. His legs buckled, and with a strangled yelp, he collapsed. As the high-loose stone's power forced out the devil fruit's energy, fur receded, claws retracted, and the great form of the saber-toothed tiger shrank back into a human shape. Charles removed the enchanted cuffs. Logan shook his head, blinking the haze of magic from his eyes, then pushed himself to his feet as strength flooded back. "From now on," Charles said firmly, "you must learn to control your power. Never let it run wild again." Logan squared his shoulders and met his father's gaze with renewed resolve. "Yes, Dad." Charles watched in surprise as Logan seemed to shoot up in height. One moment he was about 1.4 meters tall, and the next he stood a solid 1.5 meters. Could this animal-type devil fruit also accelerate growth? He wondered. A brief flicker of thought about the prized vampire fruit crossed his mind, but he shook it off and turned his attention to the next candidate. "Julie, your turn. Pick whatever ability you like," Charles called. Without a moment's hesitation, Julie strode forward. Her small face held a determined expression that made Charles proud. She might be stubborn in her studies, but when it came to training, she threw herself into it, often sparring with Esther to hone her swordsmanship. "Go ahead, Julie," Charles encouraged. Julie paused in front of the array of devil fruits, fingers brushing over each one as she weighed her options. She straightened the small knife strapped to her waist, then zeroed in on the Superman-type sickle fruit. With a decisive step, she reached out and lifted it from its pedestal. "Dad, I want this sickle fruit," she announced, holding it up for inspection. Charles leaned forward to examine the sickle fruit in her hand. It wasn't the flashiest choice. Its deep green shell was plain compared to some of the other fruits, but its potential power was undeniable. A broad smile spread across Charles's face. "Perfect choice," he said. "If that's what you want, then it's yours." Charles watched his father nod in approval and stifled his groan. He picked up the sickle fruit, bit into it, and swallowed without changing his expression. Around him, his brothers and sisters burst into applause. Charles couldn't help but twist the corners of his mouth into a satisfied grin. "All right, show us what you've got," his father called out. Charles turned his attention to the row of sandbags swaying at the far end of the yard. He closed his eyes for a moment, gathering the pulse of energy surging through his body. Then, with a quick movement, he drew the wooden practice sword from his waist and swung it in a clean, arcing slash. A razor-sharp gust of wind shot from the blade, cutting straight through the nearest sandbag and splitting it in two. The other sandbags shuddered but remained intact. "What is that?" someone whispered. Estes, the senior trainee, leaped to his feet, eyes wide. He had seen many sword techniques, but nothing like this. Charles himself stared at the sword in amazement. It was just a wooden blade, yet right now it seemed charged with a living force. "That's not a flying slash," Estes muttered under his breath. "That's a wind blade." I was still on guard against the sword hero's flying slash, so much so that when I sensed that surge of sword energy, I almost thought he'd appeared. I turned to survey the damage Julie had caused. Broken crates and splintered barrels littered the training yard. Then I looked back at her. She was trembling, her face pale from the effort of unleashing that wind blade. "Julie," I said, keeping my voice steady, "your devil fruit power is formidable, but you nearly exhausted yourself just now. Remember, a devil fruit is only a tool, not a substitute for real skill. A true swordsman hones his blade through hard work and discipline, not through tricks. Don't forget that." Julie drew herself up and nodded firmly. "Yes, father, I understand." I offered her a small, encouraging smile. "Good. Let's move on then. Philip?" At that, Philip practically leapt forward, excitement shining in his eyes. Before I could say another word, he was already examining the devil fruits on display. First he studied the superpower division, carefully weighing each option. Then he drifted to the superhuman fruits, still debating. Finally, he paused before the elemental section, his hand hovering uncertainly as he tried to make up his mind. Philip didn't even glance at the Zoan animal, devil fruits, once. "Take your time," Charles said, leaning against the display. "Don't rush." His son's brow furrowed as he studied the dozens of fruits before him. Charles couldn't help but smile. With so many devil fruits laid out, it was no wonder Philip was overwhelmed. After all, whichever power he chose would bind him for life. From Philip's initial excitement to the hesitation that now twisted his features, it was clear he was wrestling with the weight of this decision all on his own. Philip stared at the fruits for a long moment, then finally settled on the lone Logia-type swamp fruit. "This is the one I want," he declared, picking it up as if drawing a sword. "I want to feel elemental power for myself." Charles nodded in approval. "Then eat it, son." Without another word, Philip bit into the devil fruit. Instantaneously, his expression soured, his face contorted, every muscle trembling as he fought back waves of nausea. Yet he persisted, chewing and swallowing with grim determination until not a single bite remained. Standing quietly, Charles watched with a mix of pride and concern. He knew that once a devil fruit was consumed, the eater's fate was sealed, and now Philip's journey had truly begun. Philip tossed the discarded core aside with a disgusted snort. "Ugh! This tastes horrible!" No sooner had he spoken than his body collapsed into a slick, muddy puddle. "Elementalization?" he murmured, watching in fascination as his arms stretched and reformed at his command. In moments, he'd reshaped himself into odd, gooey configurations, testing the limits of his new power. "Ha!" Philip crowed, snapping back upright. "I'm part of the nature element now." He shot his younger brother, Trunks, a triumphant wink. Trunks scowled and stepped forward. "You stole that swamp fruit from me, you know?" His fists clenched, but he forced himself to hold back. "Philip, change back right now." Fine, fine. Philip folded his arms and closed his eyes, concentrating. The muddy sheen peeled away until he stood firm and whole again. At that moment, Charles stepped forward and raised a hand. The other children, wide-eyed and eager, fell silent. "Very good, Philip," Charles said, voice calm but carrying over the courtyard. "You've shown remarkable control, but remember, fruit abilities are a tool, not a crutch. Your body, your training, remains your greatest asset. Never neglect it." He let the words sink in, letting his gaze sweep across the dozen young faces before him. The lesson was clear. Powers could open new doors, but discipline and physical mastery would always lead the way. "Yes!" At the sight of Charles's serious expression, the others echoed him instantly. "Got it! Next!" Charles gave a quick wave to Philip, then turned his attention to Trunks. With this youngster, there was never a dull moment. He was nothing if not a handful. Chapter 300. At just 6 years old, Charles had already earned a reputation for his short temper. If his younger brother Trunks dared to cross him, Charles wouldn't hesitate to stand his ground or throw a punch. It wasn't that he didn't care for his siblings. In fact, he doted on them. But push him far enough, and he'd erupt. Their father stood before a polished table where 7 devil fruits lay arranged in neat rows. With a patient smile, he addressed Trunks. "All right, boy, it's your turn. Choose one. Think carefully. And if you decide you'd rather not eat a devil fruit, that's fine too. I won't force you." Charles leaned back in his chair, arms folded, watching Trunks consider the remaining options. Only 2 categories remained: paramecia, the superhuman types, and zoan, the animal types. Trunks bypassed the zoans without a second glance. He swept his gaze over the paramecia fruits one by one, each orb shimmering with promise, until he paused at the bright magma-red sphere known as the hot fruit. No hesitation, Trunks reached out and picked it up. "Father, I want this one, the hot fruit." Their father nodded in approval, then shot Charles a quick look. A fiery temper paired with a magma fruit, that combination could get explosive. Charles couldn't help but think of his calm friend Owen. He'd never be so reckless. With his father's blessing, Trunks cradled the surprisingly large fruit in both hands, studied its glowing surface for a moment, then took a decisive bite. Charles watched in tense silence as Trunks forced down the final morsel of the devil fruit. The foul, acrid taste lingered on his tongue, and his face twisted with effort. Everyone knew that a single bite was enough to awaken a devil fruit's power, but if you didn't eat the whole thing, the transformation could be incomplete or unstable. Mothers like Xia Luoning swore it was safer to devour every last bit, and that zeal had cost many children dearly. Each fruit awakened meant a fresh trial for the body. Even Caesar had once tried 2 at once. Now Trunks's small frame heaved as he swallowed, his stomach bulging beneath his shirt. Charles leaned forward, heart pounding. "How is it? Do you feel any different?" At first, Trunks shook his head. Then he stiffened. A stream of white-hot vapor hissed from the top of his skull, rising in a glowing plume. Instantly, the chamber grew stifling. The lamp's flames danced, the air itself seeming to crackle. A ripple of unease passed over Estes, who stood to one side. Cold radiance bloomed around him like frost, pushing back the sudden heat. Oddly, Trunks did not feel warmth or strength surging through him. Instead, an icy chill crept down his spine. He clutched his head, breath coming in panicked gasps. "Dad!" he cried, voice cracking with fear. "I can't feel anything," Trunks exclaimed, panic edging his voice. Charles rolled his eyes. "That's because you've basically blacked out. You need to get your overheating heat under control, now." Trunks froze, bewildered. "Okay, but how? My devil fruit power is spiraling out of control." Charles pinched the bridge of his nose and let out a frustrated sigh. Then he produced a pair of handcuffs carved from faintly glowing Hylu stone. "Lucky for both of us, I came prepared. Step forward." Obediently, Trunks held out his left wrist. Charles snapped the Hylu stone cuff into place. No sooner had the metal closed than Trunks wavered on his feet, as though all his strength was being siphoned away. Charles tightened his grip on the other side of the cuff. "From now on, you wear this. Do not remove it for at least 24 hours, and while it's on, get your body moving. Light training, breathing exercises, whatever it takes to stabilize your power." Trunks shot Charles a pained look, but Charles ignored his discomfort. He knew all too well what happened when a devil fruit ability went unchecked. When Esdeath was very young, he accidentally ate a devil fruit that gripped him with an icy power. From time to time, he'd involuntarily exhale blasts of frigid air, and anyone close enough would feel as though their bones were turning to ice. In the height of summer, the maids who cared for him still wore padded cotton jackets just to endure his presence. Even Esdeath's own mother dared not hold him for long, fearing the chill would seep into her very marrow. Years later, his younger brother Trunks began to show the same frost-bitten symptoms. This time, though, Charles had prepared. He'd fashioned special Seastone wristbands, known to suppress devil fruit abilities, and fitted one to Trunks's wrist. The boy glared bitterly at the heavy bracelet before slinking away. Then it was Charles's turn. Master Kakarot strode onto the makeshift stage and proclaimed, "Choose one!" Charles scanned the lineup of devil fruits, a blazing flame fruit, a crackling thunder fruit, others he'd already dismissed. His heart pounded when he spotted one last fruit, unmarked, utterly unfamiliar, balanced on Kakarot's fingertip. "Dad," Charles blurted, "can I have that one?" Kakarot's brow shot up. "That one? There's no record of its power. It's almost certainly worthless. Trash, even. You shouldn't touch it." Charles squared his shoulders. "None of the others interest me. I want to roll the dice on the unknown fruit." For a long moment, Kakarot studied his son. Then the corner of his mouth curled into a grin. "A gamble, eh? Very well." Charles's eyes were grave. "Do you realize that if you lose this bet, it's for life?" Kakarot held his father's gaze without hesitation. "I know. If this turns out to be a worthless devil fruit, then I've drawn the short straw. I'll spend my days training my body instead. But if I win—" He let the sentence hang, but the resolve in his voice left no doubt. Charles's heart tightened. He hadn't expected such determination from his son. Slowly, Charles picked up the strange, swirling fruit and placed it in Kakarot's palm. The boy examined its iridescent skin, jaw clenched, then bit in with a single decisive motion. He swallowed it whole, discarded the core, and closed his eyes to feel the currents of power coursing through him. The onlookers leaned forward, breath caught. Charles found himself unable to look away. At last, he exhaled and asked, "Well? Any change? Is it an animal type, a superhuman paramecia, or a natural logia?" Kakarot opened his eyes after a moment's pause and shook his head. "It's neither animal nor natural. I'm sure of it. It's superhuman." "An ability." Kakarot stared at his fingers in astonishment. In a blink, a playing card materialized between his thumb and forefinger. "The card fruit Superman Edition," he announced, grinning. "Let's brainstorm its potential." He held the Queen of Spades aloft. The others gaped. Caesar frowned. "What good is a card fruit supposed to do?" Before anyone else could answer, Estes snapped his fingers and delivered a sharp smack to Caesar's head. "Quiet," he scolded. "Don't spout nonsense." Estes shot Caesar a warning glare. Meanwhile, Charles stepped forward for a closer look. He studied the card, its glossy surface catching the light. "Not bad," he admitted, "but what it can become depends entirely on how you develop it." He paused, letting the words sink in. A card fruit might sound like nothing more than a fancy toy, just a standard deck of cards, but in Kakarot's hands, he realized, it could evolve into something far more versatile. With the right refinement, its power could be projected at a distance, unhindered by the physical card itself. Kakarot nodded silently, his expression unreadable. Behind that blank mask of concentration, he was no doubt plotting how to unlock this fruit's true potential.